The warm wind of the afternoon blew between the Phrygia fields, stroking the leaves of the olive trees and the golden wheat that extended as an endless ocean. King Midas was on his throne, a man whose imposing figure was just a mask for the restlessness he hid inside. Rumors about their desire for greatness had spread as flames in a dry hill, and their subjects murmured in the markets, fearing the weight of their ambition. In ancient Greece, the gods were more than heavenly figures, they were part of the daily breath of mortals. They lived in their stories, in the stars, and in the shadows of the temples that rose with glowing marble. It was a time where each human act could attract divine favor or immortal anger. And Midas, governing his fertile kingdom, was in the center of this interaction between mortals and gods. The days in their court shone with splendor. The richness of the kingdom was legendary, reflected in the golden vessels, the robes embroidered with silver thread, and the banquets that never ended. But while his advisors praised his fortune, Midas could not satisfy. His gaze was lost on the horizon, yearning for something he could not name. He was a man trapped in his own desire, looking in the oracle's answers that never arrived. The ancient Greeks believed that balance was essential in life. The harmony between pleasures and responsibilities, between desires and limitations. But Midas, blinded by his obsession, ignored these teachings. The poets talked about their insatiable desire to accumulate more, to turn the mundane into extraordinary, and it was this search for the extraordinary that would change their destiny forever. One afternoon, while the birds sang on the nearby pines, a mysterious traveler appeared in the Palacio de Midas. Its appearance was unusual, a mixture of nobility and carelessness, and its presence radiated an energy that none of the courtiers could ignore. Midas, intrigued, offered hospitality, as was customary among the Greeks. It was this seemingly innocent decision that initiated the chain of events that would lead him to his legendary curse. At that time, power and wealth were tangible symbols of divine favor, but they were also traps for ambitious hearts. The king knew this in the depths of his being, but he repressed it with each glass of wine that he raised and every currency he added to his treasures. It was as if trying to fill a vacuum that had no background, ignoring the warnings of the wise men who talked about the dangers of wishing more than one needs. The traveler, whose identity had not yet revealed, watched Midas with a look that seemed to see through his skin. There was something uncomfortable in his presence, as if he represented a test that the king did not yet understand. The days passed, and the stories of this meeting began to weave in the dark corners of the palace. Who really was this man? Why had he get there? The Greeks knew that the gods walked among them disguised, testing the virtue and humility of mortals. Maybe this traveler was one of those divine figures, bringing with him a challenge that would reveal the true character of Midas. But the king, blinded by his desire for greatness, did not see the signs. The decisions that were about to be taken would be remembered for centuries, narrated in songs and poems as a reminder of the consequences of wishing more than the heart can bear. The night came with a full moon that bathed the palace in a ghostly light. The traveler asked to speak with the king in private. No one knows what exact words they exchanged that night, but the result of that conversation marked the beginning of a story that would resonate in eternity. The silence wrapped the court when Midas left the next day, his face illuminated by something more than dawn. It seemed possessed by a determination that nobody understood. His subjects watched him with a mixture of admiration and fear, while the king entered more on a path that would move him away from ordinary life and take him to an extraordinary destiny. At that time, the air in Phrygia seemed loaded with a different energy, as if the gods themselves were expectant. Something was about to change. The life of the king, his kingdom, and the world that surrounded him were about to transform, in ways that no one, not even Measure, could have imagined. In the heart of the Midas palace, where stone walls shone with the reflection of golden tapestries, the royal family lived under the weight of both powerful and dangerous inheritance. Midas did not rule alone. After him there was a story of ancient lineages, a chain of ancestors who wove the identity of his dynasty. In each gesture, in each word, in each decision, the shadow of its ancestors, this band present, a constant reminder that its crown was a legacy that should honor. Midas was the son of Gordias, the founding king whose name was linked to the famous Not Impossible to Unleash. According to legend, Gordias had been a humble peasant before being chosen by the gods to govern. This divine choice marked the beginning of a dynasty that always lived with one foot in the deadly world and another in the kingdom of the gods. Since then, the descendants of Gordias were considered special, chosen to carry not only the crown, but also the weight of heavenly expectations. Midas's family not only represented earthly power, it was a sacred link with the gods. In the Greek world, royal blood was seen as a direct channel towards the divine, and any action of a family member had repercussions not only on Earth, but also on the cosmos. Midas's mother, whose name was lost in time, was described as a woman of imposing beauty and wisdom that inspired both respect and fear. She taught Midas since childhood that power without wisdom was like a sword without edge, dangerous and useless. But these lessons, although recorded in the memory of the young prince, would be forgotten in the crucial moments of his life. Midas had a wife, of which the stories are scarce, but their presence was fundamental in court. She was known for her serene character and her ability to balance her husband's intense emotions. It was said that she could calm the king's anger with a single word, and that, in her smile, there was a greater power than any army. Despite his role as queen, it was evident that his influence transcended the formalities of the throne. She was a woman who understood the fragilities of Midas better than anyone, but whose unconditional love also prevented him from confronting him in the darkest moments. The most beloved member of the royal family was his daughter, a girl whose name resonated as a melody in the palace halls, Zoe. His laugh was like the song of the birds at dawn, and his presence illuminated even the most gloomy days. Zoe had the gift of transforming his father's severity into tenderness. In his eyes, Midas found the only purity that seemed to save him from himself. She was the jewel of the kingdom, a small figure who walked through the palace gardens with flowers in her hands and dreams in her heart. Despite the unity they appeared, the royal family lived under constant tension. The insatiable desire for Midas for achieving unmatched greatness collided with the most traditional values of his lineage. The elders of the court, who remembered the stories of Chubby and the teachings of the gods, murmured that Midas had forgotten the lessons of humility that their father had guided. The king's ambition was like a river that overflowed his margins, dragging not only his destiny, but also that of his family. In the silence of the night, when the stars shone on the walls of the palace, Midas used to walk alone through the gardens, reflecting on their legacy. At that time, he thought of Zoe and how his future was linked to the decisions he made. She also thought about the queen, the strength of her spirit, and how she endured her obsession with a patience that sometimes confused with indifference. But these reflections were passengers. The king's ambition always ended up turning off the flames of doubt. The royal family was no stranger to court intrigues. Nobles with false smiles and double-intention words moved in the shadows, waiting for any opportunity to influence the king's decisions. Despite this, Midas trusted a few, and his closest circle always revolved around blood ties. However, even those ties began to show fissures, small cracks that would become deeper as the king's desire grew and the curse that was about to trigger wrapped their lives. At that time, the family was a pillar that supported the kingdom, but also a rope that tied up to its human responsibilities. What the king did not know was that that same rope was destined to tense until he breaks. The history of Midas would not only be remembered for its golden touch, but for the impact that it would have on those whom it loved. His legacy, forged in gold, would be dyed from his family's tears, marking a dark chapter in the history of his dynasty. In the fertile valleys of Phrygia, where the wheat fields danced to the rhythm of the wind and the mountains rose as eternal guardians, the myth of Midas was born, a man whose ambition led him to transcend the borders of the human. Phrygia, a minor Asia region wrapped in an air of mystery, was known both for its wealth and for their stories of kings that challenged the gods. Midas wasn't just a king, it was a symbol, a reflection of human desire to achieve the impossible, even if the price was its own humanity. The figure of Midas in Phrygia mythology was deeply connected to fertility and abundance. As king, Midas was seen as the mediator between his people and the divine forces that secured the crops. In a land where the gold of the fields was more valued than the gold of the chests, its role was crucial. Phrygia mythology did not present it as a greedy man from the beginning, but as a sovereign who understood the fragility of balance between nature and human power. However, Midas's ambition was growing like a dark seed in his heart, watered for his obsession with success and recognition. In Phrygia, the cult of Mother Earth, known as Cybele, was central. This goddess, represented as a powerful maternal figure, symbolized fertility and regeneration. According to legends, Midas was a fervent devotee of Cybele, offering sacrifices in temples and looking for their guidance in times of need. However, her relationship with the goddess was ambivalent, marked both by reverence and by the desire to achieve a power that even challenges her authority. This connection with Cybele's underlined Midas' duality, a divided king between gratitude and greed. The Phrygios stories describe Midas as a man whose wealth not only measured in gold, but also in the respect of his people and the prosperity of their lands. His palace, built in the hills, was an architectural wonder that reflected the opulence of his kingdom. But within those golden walls, Midas began to lose contact with the essential. While his subjects saw in him a protector, rumors about his growing obsession with wealth began to spread like a shadow on Phrygia. The myth of Midas merged with the Greek traditions, transforming King Phrygio into a more complex character, loaded with symbolism. In Greek mythology, Phrygia was seen as a liminal earth, a place where gods and humans interact in unpredictable ways. This perception reinforced the idea that Midas was a man trapped between two worlds, the earthly, full of needs and desires, and the divine, unattainable but tempting. Her story was adopted by the Greeks, who enriched her with tragic elements that reflected her own philosophical concerns about power, morality, and human fragility. The episode of the Touch of Gold, although better known in the Greek tradition, has its roots in the Phrygia narrative. The ancient Phrygios believed that gold represented both wealth and corruption. For them, the gift of Midas was not only a divine punishment, but a manifestation of the disconnection between man and nature. In a world where rivers were revered as deities and trees were sacred, turning everything into gold was seen as an act of violence against the very essence of life. The connection between Midas and Phrygia was also manifested in his death. According to legends, the king ended his life in solitude, taking refuge in the forests of his homeland. Some stories suggest that Midas, unable to withstand the weight of his mistakes, threw himself into the Pactolo River. This river, which flowed through Phrygia, became a redemption symbol, since its waters were impregnated with the gold particles that were said came from the repentance of the king. For the Phrygios, this final act was not only a tragedy, but a lesson about the need to reconcile with nature and the gods. The legacy of Midas in Phrygia mythology is a reminder that even the greatest power can crumble under the weight of greed. In the lands where wheat and vine prospered, its history was told as a warning, a way of teaching future generations that true wealth is not found in gold, but in harmony with the world around us. However, the echo of his decisions continued to resonate, transforming his life into a legend that crossed borders and times. In a dawn dyed of purple and golden tones, when the dew still caressed the fields and the air smelled of fresh wine, Midas had its first encounter with the god Dionysus. That day, fate seemed to abandon the laws of the earthly world and dance to the beat of the songs of the gods. Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility and celebration, had arrived in Phrygia accompanied by his entourage of satyrs and Menades, a chaotic and lush procession that filled the forests with laughter, songs, and the sound of drums. Midas, who used to walk through the forests of his kingdom seeking inspiration and peace, did not expect to meet a god. He had heard of Dionysus, his unbridled parties and his dual nature, capable of blessing or destroying according to his humor. But at that time too, the king did not see a dangerous god, I saw a being whose power overflowed. Dionysus was not like other gods that imposed fear. There was something human in his laugh, something deeply irresistible in his presence. The connection between Midas and Dionysus was not accidental. According to legends, the king had helped Sileno, the faithful companion of the god, days before this encounter. Sileno, an old and wise satyr, had been lost in the forest after a long night of celebration. He was found by the men of Midas, staggering and singing songs about the secrets of the cosmos. Instead of expelling or ridiculing him, Midas treated him with respect. He took him to his palace, offered him food and refuge, and patiently heard the delusional stories that Sileno narrated between wine drinks. When Dionysus knew the gesture of Midas towards his partner, he decided to give the king a gift. But the encounter between them was more than a simple divine transaction. In ancient stories, Dionysus appears as a mirror of human desires and weaknesses. Seeing Midas, God not only saw a powerful king, he saw a man hungry for something else, a vacuum that neither wealth nor power could fill. Dionysus, with his mysterious smile, offered Midas the opportunity to desire anything that his heart yearns. The moment Midas expressed his desire was loaded with tension and expectation. In front of Dionysus, with forests as witnesses, the king asked what he thought he was the greatest of the gifts, that everything he touched became gold. The god, who could see beyond words, understood the implications of that desire. But Dionysus was not a god who interfered directly to human elections. His role was to allow mortals to face the consequences of their own yearnings. "Granted," said Dionysus, with a voice that resonated like the wind between the leaves. There were no rays or earthquakes, the change was silent but definitive. Midas felt a chill to travel his body, a tingling in his hands that seemed to promise him eternal glory. However, Dionysus, with a look that mixed compassion and cunning, left the king with a warning that would soon charge a devastating meaning: be careful what you want, Midas. What is not always gold is not always what shines. In this first meeting, Dionysus was not only a benefactor, he was also a provocateur, a god who revealed the contradictions of Midas. By giving him the touch of gold, he did not bless him or curse him directly. Rather, he gave him the opportunity to face his own limits, his inability to understand that true wealth is not measured in coins or in power. Dionysus disappeared as fast as he had arrived, leaving Midas in a state of euphoria, convinced that his life was about to change forever. The interaction with Dionysus marked the principle of an irreversible transformation in Midas. Although at that time the king did not know, that gift that seemed so perfect was going to become the root of his tragedy. But, for now, Midas was drunk with hope and ambition, outside the shadow that began to grow behind him. Before the golden touch changed his life forever, the kingdom of Midas was a vibrant place, full of life and prosperity. Located in the fertile plains of Phrygia, the landscape was a mosaic of green valleys, soft hills, and crystalline rivers that serpent as arteries of natural wealth. This place did not need gold to shine, the earth itself was a treasure, a blessing that many believed sent by the gods. The people lived in harmony with their surroundings, cultivating the fields and grazing sheep and goats in the meadows. The villages were full of bustle, with markets full of fruits, spices, and crafts. In the squares, the musicians played cheerful melodies, and the children ran between the posts, while women wove stories as much as fabrics. There was a sense of community, a union that made life, although humble, was rich in meaning. In the center of all this was the Palacio de Midas, a construction that reflected both the opulence and the ingenuity of its people. Although it was not adorned with gold, its polished stone walls and the intricate engravings that decorated them spoke of a kingdom that valued beauty as much as functionality. The palace gardens were famous throughout the region, with exotic flowers that perfumed the air and fountains that whispered water songs. Midas ruled with a unique balance between authority and generosity. He was a king who understood the value of the land and the effort of his people. Under their command, the barns were always full, and the festivals were frequent, celebrations where everyone, from the peasants to the nobles, gathered to honor the gods and enjoy the fruits of their work. Although Midas was known for his wise judgment, there were also in him a spark of ambition, a restlessness that seemed to always push him to look for more. However, that ambition was not always evident. For his people, Midas was a protector, someone who watched for his well-being and assured peace. In the battlefields, he had demonstrated his courage, defending his land of invaders and consolidating his power in the region. But in the halls of his palace, surrounded by directors and artists, he showed a more introspective side, fascinated by the stories of other kings and the legends of unmatched wealth. The king had a close relationship with nature. It spent long hours in the forests that surrounded the kingdom, watching animals and listening to the sounds of the trees. He believed that nature was a reflection of the gods, a force that should be respected and taken care of. But in his heart, Midas began to feel a yearning, a thirst for something bigger, something he could not find in the simple beauty of his kingdom. Despite its success, Midas was not immune to the influence of travelers and merchants who brought news from distant lands. Stories of cities made of gold, palaces that shone like the sun, and wealth that overcame the imagination filled their minds of images that began to dye their perception of what I already had. Little by little, those stories planted in it the seed of dissatisfaction, a desire to transcend, to leave a legacy that resonated beyond the borders of Phrygia. The kingdom of Midas, in its initial splendor, did not need golden ornaments to be great. Their wealth was in their people, in their land, and in the traditions that kept the connection between them and the gods alive. However, the human heart is complex, and in Midas a contradiction began to take shape. A part of it deeply valued what he already possessed, while another yearning what he thought he was missing. It was in this context that the king found himself on the threshold of a change that would mark not only his life, but that of his entire kingdom. Without knowing it, the desire that had slowly growing inside him was about to manifest himself in a way that he would transform everything he touched, for better or worse. But for now, Midas walked among his people as a beloved king, without imagining that his greatest desire would become his greatest evidence. The air was loaded with expectation, as if the gods themselves were containing their breath. Midas, standing in front of Dionysus, felt how blood was beating hard in his temples. It was a transcendental moment, one that he himself did not completely understand. The god of wine, with his majestic bearing and penetrating look, had offered me a unique gift, the power to decide his destiny with a simple desire. And at that moment, the king of Phrygia knew what he wanted. Midas's desire was not born of the need, but of something deeper and disturbing, an insatiable hunger for transcendence. For years, he had ruled a prosperous kingdom, a happy people, a home full of abundance. But within him, that persistent voice, that disturbing whisper, told him it was not enough. It was not gold that was missing in his life, but the desire to leave a mark that no other king could overcome. He wanted his name to resonate beyond the borders, beyond time. The origin of that desire went back to the stories he had heard as a child. Stories about the heroes and gods that mold the world with their actions, which challenged the laws of mortals and rose as immortal figures. From a young age, Midas had felt the need to be more than a man. He dreamed of a power that would separate him from others, to raise him to the height of the myths. And now, in front of Dionysus, that opportunity seemed to be within reach of his hands. The atmosphere around was almost surreal. The forest trees waved with a soft wind, their leaves whispered songs that only the gods could understand. Dionysus's companions watched in silence, some with curiosity, others with a slight smile that bordered the mockery. The god, however, showed no emotion. His eyes were still fixed on Midas, as if they could cross their soul and see the cracks that hid their darkest wishes. When Midas finally spoke, he did it with a firm voice, although inside his heart drummed with a mixture of fear and euphoria. "I want everything you touch becoming gold." His statement, simple and direct, resonated in the forest as an endless echo. The word seemed almost divine, loaded with a force that neither he understood at all. Dionysus watched him in silence for a moment that he felt eternal. He didn't ask questions, he didn't ask for explanations. But there was something in his expression that suggested that he understood much more than Midas believed. Finally, God spoke, "Your desire will be granted." His voice was like a thunder content, powerful but controlled. But remember, the gifts of the gods are not always what they seem. At that moment, the world seemed to change. Midas felt a strange current across his body, like a cold fire that lit every cell of his being. His hands, which until then had been like those of any other man, now felt different, as if they were imbued with an indescribable power. He couldn't help looking at his palms, trying to discern if something had changed physically. But everything seemed the same. And yet, I knew that nothing would be as before. Midas's decision was not taken lightly, although many might think otherwise. In his mind, the desire was not only for him, but for his kingdom, his legacy, his family. I imagined a future where Phrygia became the richest land in the world, a place where the treasures sprout from the ground and future generations will remember Midas as the king who challenged the same gods and won. It was, in his vision, an act of greatness, not of selfishness. However, under that ambition a subtle fear was beaten, one that Midas did not dare to admit or before himself. What if the gift was too much? What if, in his desire to power, he was about to exceed the limits that the gods had established for mortals? But it was too late to go back. Dionysus had given his word, and desire was sealed. The god said goodbye with an enigmatic look, leaving Midas alone in the middle of the forest. But in his departure, he also left a shadow, a feeling that the path that the king had chosen would not be as bright as the gold he now dreamed. Midas, however, could not see that shadow. For him, the future shone like a newborn sun, and his hands, now transformed, promised him a power that he believed infinite. The dawn bathed the kingdom of Phrygia with its golden light, but for Midas, that day it marked the beginning of an era that shone beyond any dawn. Standing in his main hall, the king extended his hand with an almost reverent gesture. In front of him, a small bouquet of flowers rested on a wooden table. It was a simple object, something everyday, but in Midas's eyes it was reflected as if it were the greatest of treasures. Without hesitation, he allowed the fingertips to touch the petals. What happened later was almost magical. A girlfriend of golden light wrapped the flowers, transforming them into a solid set of pure gold. Each sheet, each petal, now shone with an almost blinding shine. Midas backed a step, with a mixture of astonishment and euphoria that bristled his skin. It was real. The gift of Dionysus was not an empty promise. Every object that touched became the most coveted metal in the world. That morning, Midas toured the halls of his palace as a child who has discovered a new game. He touched the silk curtains, and these became a metallic tissue, heavy but dazzling. The doors of the doors, the fruits arranged in bowls, even the simple stones on the ground, everything was given to the touch of their hands, adopting that golden glow. His servants looked at him with open eyes, amazed and fearful at the same time. Some began to whisper that Midas had been blessed directly by the gods, others doubted if that was really a blessing. The king, however, was intoxicated by power. He imagined a future in which his kingdom would be a symbol of unprecedented wealth. He saw his name inscribed in the stories as the most glorious monarch that had ever existed. Who could challenge a man who literally created wealth just by touching her? In his eyes, the gift of Dionysus was not only a gift, it was a tool to raise it to the level of the same gods. But soon, the emotion of that initial discovery began to intermingle with disconcerting moments. In an oversight, Midas touched a piece of bread that one of his servants offered him. Before his eyes, the food hardened and acquired the golden brightness that was already beginning to recognize. The same happened with a glass of wine. When rubbing it, the liquid stopped flowing, transforming into a solid, motionless and shiny piece. Midas tried to laugh at these incidents, to take them as little inconveniences in their new glorious life. But deep down, a sense of restlessness began to settle. The day passed with the same rhythm. As his hand slipped through the objects in his surroundings, Midas realized something he had not planned. Gold was cold, immutable. The vibrant color of the flowers, the sweet aroma of the freshly baked bread, the refreshing sensation of the wine when passing through its throat, all of that disappeared when replaced by the inert perfection of gold. For the first time, the king felt a vacuum that he could not fill, although the brightness around him seemed to promise otherwise. In the afternoon, while walking through the palace jardines, Midas tried to separate those thoughts. Touched a branch of a nearby tree, and as expected, it became pure gold. But in doing so, the birds who had perched on it fled scared, as if they perceived something unnatural in that touch. Midas looked at his hands, those same hands that had been a source of pride and were now transformation tools. He felt a flash of doubt. Was this power really what I had wanted? That night, during the royal banquet, things took a more gloomy turn. When trying to feed, everything he played became gold before reaching his lips. Fruits, meats, even water became unusable objects, as beautiful as it is useless. The diners, who at the beginning had celebrated their ability with admiration, began to look at me with concern. Some moved away slightly, fearful that the golden touch could spread beyond inanimate objects. Midas, hungry and frustrated, left the table in silence. He went up to his room, feeling the weight of one day that had begun with promises of greatness but ended with a feeling of isolation. He dropped into his bed, but even that shelter became golden contact with his skin. Gold, with all its brightness, did not offer comfort. It was relentless, a constant presence that began to invade all aspects of his life. That night, while the moon illuminated the lands of Phrygia, Midas remained awake, contemplating the power he had longed for with such intensity. His hands, who had built a kingdom, who had caressed their loved ones, now seemed strange, almost alien. For the first time, the glory of gold seemed more than a gift. His feet, when playing the marble floor, left a trace of golden footprints. Each step turned the cold marble into pure gold, but at the same time, the surface became strangely slippery and uncomfortable. Midas went to the garden, where he always found peace between the flowers and the trees that bordered his palace. But this time, his hands could not help trying what he now seemed inevitable. He touched a small bush, and the green and vibrant leaves became cold and shining. His fingers touched the roses of a rose bush, and what was previously a spectacle of bright colors became a lifeless sculpture, perfect but without a soul. The gardeners observed the scene with disbelief, some even backed up. They did not know whether to applaud their king's ability or fear what it meant. Midas, on the other hand, was divided between the amazement and a slight sharp of sadness that did not finish recognizing. The golden roses were impressive, but the sweet aroma that used to permeate that corner of the garden had completely disappeared. Back inside the palace, curiosity led him to experiment with more everyday objects. A glass became golden with a simple touch. He touched a sword hanging on a wall, and the leaf was transformed, losing its edge in the process. Even a small mouse that crossed his way was motionless, his body now turned into a golden figure that shone in the sunlight. That last incident left him ice cream. Although the mouse meant nothing for him, the vision of the little creature transformed into something so rigid and eternal disturbed him in a way he did not expect. Midas looked at his hands, those hands that had been the source of his pride as ruler, and for the first time he felt a slight fear of them. However, power continued to exercise undeniable magnetism about him. Each new object that touched fascinated him. A ceramic vessel, a wooden chair, even a simple piece of cloth, everything became gold under its touch. The servants watched him with a mixture of admiration and confusion, wondering if their king really understood the implications of what was happening. At the end of the day, Midas gathered some of his directors and showed them his gift. Elu, like everyone else, were impressed, but also raised questions that Midas did not want to hear. What would happen to food? With the people I loved? With the same nature that surrounded his kingdom? The king, confident in his ability to handle any challenge, hunger began to bite it, but every attempt to eat ended in the same thing: fruits, bread, meat, everything became gold before I could enjoy it. For the first time, a feeling of helplessness invaded him. The gold I wanted so much could not feed him, he could not calm his thirst. And while he observed his reflection on a tray that he had unintentionally turned into a pure gold plate, he began to understand that this power that had longed out was not as simple as it seemed. But he still couldn't stop. I couldn't accept that something that shone so much could bring something different to happiness. Tears began to form in their eyes, while their hands, trembling, touched another fruit, another cup. Gold continued to accumulate around him, a wealth that, at that time, seemed heavier than any other load he had taken before. The Midas Palace, which until then had been a place of life, luxury, and activity, began to transform into something more similar to a motionless work of art. Every corner that the king touched changed, losing its original essence. The walls, once decorated with vibrant frescoes that told stories of victories and festivals, became golden surfaces that reflected the light with a blinding intensity. The textures, the colors, everything that gave warmth to the place, now it seemed like a cold bright metal prison. The halls echoed with a strange silence. What was previously a space full of laughs, steps and conversations, was now dominated by the echo of the carefully measured movements of the servants, who avoided touching any surface by fear of altering something or, worse, to become gold themselves. Midas, however, walked through the halls with a mixture of pride and confusion, admiring the golden footprints he left behind. The rooms, once full of furniture carved in detail, became static scenarios. The beds, tables, and chairs lost their usefulness by hardening in perfect but uncomfortable ways. The dining room, where family gatherings and real banquets used to fill the air with aromas and laughs, was now an opulent but empty show. The fruits in the centerpieces were gold, the glasses and plates shone with a cold brightness, but no one dared to touch them. In the main hall, the transformation reached an impressive and scary level. The throne of Midas, a symbol of its authority and wisdom, became a completely golden structure. The details carved in wood, which had once told stories of past kings, were now unrecognizable under the uniform gold layer. When sitting, Midas felt for the first time a physical discomfort that he could not ignore. The cold of the metal crossed his clothes and reminded him that even what seemed more solid could become strange and hostile. The sources of the inner garden of the palace, which had been a freshness oasis, stopped in their flow. The water that sprouted from its pipes froze in golden threads, motionless, capturing the light but losing its movement and sound. The flowers and trees that decorated the surroundings of the palace suffered a similar destination. What was previously a vibrant and life space now seemed a static painting, a brilliant show, but lacking a soul. The people, upon learning of the changes in the palace, began to murmur with a mixture of astonishment and fear. Some considered it a divine signal, a proof that their king was destined for something bigger than the earthly world. Others, more cautious, saw in these changes a dark omen, a warning that such an excessive wealth could bring ruin. The palace servants tried to adapt, although many failed. Those who touched by accident a newly transformed object or surface faced the impossibility of working normally. Gold, so venerated by its beauty and courage, had become a curse that even complicated the simplest tasks. A group of chefs left their posts when the kitchen tools were unusable, trapped in their golden form. Despite the difficulties, Midas did not seem to stop. He continued to explore the limits of his power, playing with curiosity objects that would not have considered special before. A marble statue, a simple carpet, even the columns that supported the roofs of the palace, everything that his hand reached became gold. Each transformation seemed to increase its feeling of control, but also isolated it more from the world that surrounded it. The days passed, and what at first was admiration on the part of the few who still had access to the king began to become fear. Some counselors, who used to talk to him in an open and direct way, now remained at a distance, fearful of the implications of this change. Midas, blinded by the brightness of their own power, did not perceive how people slowly moved away, leaving it alone in their transformed palace. The golden opulence that wrapped every corner of the place began to feel more like a weight than as an achievement. The spaces, although magnificent, became increasingly uninhabitable. The air was impregnated with a tense silence, broken only by the echo of the steps of Midas while walking through its creation, which was at the same time a testimony of its power and a reminder of its growing loneliness. And deep down, a silent concern began to grow in the heart of Midas. He had transformed everything that surrounded him into gold, but at what cost? The walls, the furniture, even the trees and flowers could not answer, could not comfort him. The brightness of his palace, which seemed before him a glory, now began to look like a prison. But I was not ready to face that truth, because I still believed that gold, somehow, could fill the emptiness that began to feel. Midas's relationship with his daughter, Marigold, was always his most precious treasure. She, so full of life, so cheerful, with her laughs that filled the halls of the palace, was the true jewel of her kingdom. Midas did not know greater wealth than her daughter's love, a sweet girl who saw the world with innocent and brilliant eyes. Since she was born, he had promised that nothing in his possession would lack, that he would never allow something or someone shadowed his happiness. His laugh was the music that resonated in the heart of Midas, the melody that softened the shadows of his thoughts and that gave him purpose. But all that changed when the golden touch began to drag with him not only his kingdom, but also what he loved most in this world. A sunny afternoon, Midas was in its gardens, inspecting the latest transformations he had made with his touch. The golden flowers shone under the sunlight, and the air was impregnated with a strange silence. His daughter, Marigold, ran to him, his clear laugh as always, and without thinking, threw himself towards his father, hugging him with all his might. Midas, unintentionally, extended his hand, touching his little head, and in a second, he saw how his daughter's life was transformed before his eyes. Marigold's soft skin, which had always been warm to touch, became rigid. His hair, which previously slipped smoothly between the fingers of Midas, hardened as golden threads. In an instant, the girl stopped moving, became a perfect statue, a golden and motionless figure in her arms. Fear seized Midas instantly. He looked at his daughter, now transformed into a golden figure, unable to move, unable to react. His eyes, who previously shone alive, were now empty. Marigold's little body, which had been his pride, was motionless, eternal, but cold as the metal that now wrapped it. A drowned crying left Midas's throat, but his tears could not save her, they couldn't return what he had lost. At that time, he understood that gold was not the only thing that had been granted. His desire, so blinding, had devastated everything that really mattered. Gold had not only played inanimate things, but had invaded the most valuable thing it had, its own blood. The girl who loved so much, her little Marigold, was no longer there. She was now just a golden figure, a sculpture that no longer breathed, that no longer laughed. Midas tried, with despair, hug her, kiss her, but the cold stiffness of gold only returned a feeling of vacuum. He hugged her again and again, without being able to undo what he had done. For a moment, he thought that if he touched her again, maybe he could return his life, that the same power that had given him the ability to turn everything into gold could reverse the damage. But every time their hands brushed their daughter, they only managed to leave more golden footprints on their figure. Nothing else happened. The following days were a torment for Midas. Every corner of the palace reminded him of what he had lost. The murmurs of the servants, the questions that arose about their daughter, made him feel even more isolated. Everyone realized what had happened, but no one dared to tell him anything. Midas could not bear the silence, nor look them das of those who previously admired him, now full of sorrow or fear. For endless nights, Midas sat next to the golden statue of Marigold, in what was previously his room, a space that had been his refuge of so many joys. Now, the room had become a mausoleum, where only gold reigned. However, the peace that used to play it no longer existed. Now there was only the sharp pain of what he had lost, a pain that could not escape his own heart. And while the kingdom continued to shine under its touch, while gold kept spreading, covering everything as an empty glory layer, Midas realized that nothing in his kingdom brought him comfort. Gold had turned his home into a heartless place, but the worst of all was that he had stolen the most precious, his daughter's love. The golden figure of Marigold, which had once been his reason to smile, was now his conviction, his constant reminder that the power he had asked to obtain more wealth had only brought him an irreparable loss. And in the still night, when everyone slept, Midas was still sitting next to him, waiting for a miracle that would never arrive. Midas observed his daughter, Marigold, with a mixture of horror and despair. What was previously a reflection of his love and pride was now a golden, motionless and cold statue. At the moment that his fingers touched his hair, something broke inside him, but did not understand it completely until that moment. She was no longer her daughter. I couldn't listen to her, I couldn't feel her heat. Everything that remained was a golden, brilliant and beautiful figure, but empty. In his arms, Midas held what was left of his child. He looked at his face, perfectly sculpted, the softness of his features now frozen in the stiffness of the metal. His eyes, before so bright and full of life, had become two golden spheres that reflected the light, but no longer saw. I couldn't hug her as before, he couldn't snuggle her or caress her hair. His daughter, the only reason for her existence, had disappeared under a layer of gold that she could never melt. The truth hit him like a hammer, gold had taken everything that really mattered. The palace, which was previously a place full of laughs and colors, had become a field of golden ruins. Each room was marked by the tragedy of his own desire. In his eagerness to reach more, to do everything he touched perfect, Midas had transformed his daughter into an inert object, stripped of everything that made her human. And now, looking at her, seeing her golden coldness, the pain wrapped him like a thick fog, impossible to dissolve. Marigold would never run towards him again, he would never call him with his sweet voice. The sound of his laughs would no longer resonate through the palace halls. Midas, again and again, caressed her daughter's golden surface, as if in doing so she could return her life, but she couldn't. The touch of gold was not reversible. It was a curse, an irrevocable conviction that had left him empty inside. No one in the kingdom dared to approach. The servants, the directors, all avoided entering the rooms where Marigold rested. Fear had taken over everyone. It was not only the fear of the power of Midas, but to the palpable horror that emanated from the golden statue. Nobody wanted to remember what had happened, but the truth was facing all, the king had lost the most important in his life. With every step that took me through the palace, the weight of the tragedy sank more. Gold, that same gold that he thought would make him happy, was crushing him. He was caught in a maze of wealth, surrounded by luxuries that no longer meant anything. The extravagance of his kingdom could not fill the hole that had opened in his chest. Nothing could. The golden walls, the gold objects, the sources that emanated water now were statues that did not move. Everything in his palace reflected the same coldness, the same void. The nights were the worst. In the dark, Midas sat next to the figure of his daughter, stroking his golden hand, wishing that for a moment the magic could get rid, that the fatal touch he had asked to return to nothing. Tears, although they could no longer fall as before, fell from their eyes, like a silent rain, as golden as their daughter. His heart broke in pieces with every sob that crossed him, but could not stop. His desire for wealth had taken him to this moment, and now he had to face the consequence. In a desperate attempt, Midas went to the gods. He called Dionysus, begging to get rid of what he had done. But the gods did not respond. The gold that now wrapped his daughter was the consequence of his own decision. No one could reverse what Midas himself had created. The fatal touch had sealed its destination, and there was no reversal. His daughter remained there, motionless, perfect in its form, but lifeless. Midas's love for her could not return her heat, she couldn't return her smile. Every time he approached, his hands trembled, and his soul drowned. How could it have been so blind? How could I have wanted something so empty? Now his daughter was lost forever, turned into a work of art that she could no longer play, she could no longer hug. The touch of gold had taken everything that really mattered to him, and it didn't matter how much he cried, Marigold's golden figure would not change. The tragedy of Midas was not only the loss of his daughter, but to realize that he had sacrificed the irreplaceable for something that had no soul. The gold I wanted so much could not fill the void he had created. The tragedy was not only in the transformation of his daughter, but in the deep pain that accompanied him every time he faced his own creation. He had touched gold, but gold had touched him in a much more cruel way. And now, with her daughter trapped forever in that cold shine, the kingdom of Midas was only a castle of solitude, surrounded by gold, but empty of everything that really mattered. The sun was no longer shining in the Palacio de Midas. The gold that previously seemed to reflect the light with a splendid beauty now seemed to overshadow everything it touched. The golden brightness that covered the walls and the ground only served to accentuate the darkness of the king's soul. Every corner of his castle, now bathed in a cold light, seemed to make fun of his anguish. Midas, caught in his own greed, could not stop looking at the figure of his daughter transformed into gold. He had spent so much time begging for wealth, believing that gold would give him power, happiness, everything he had dreamed. But the only thing he had achieved was to empty his life of what really mattered. Please, no, can't be real. What have I done? He whispered, his voice trembling with fear and despair. He knelt with his golden daughter, his hands touching the cold metal that his girl, his sea. The touch of gold had made it a bright, empty, cold, and lifeless statue. What had happened to the girl who once ran towards him with open arms, laughing? The pain in his chest intensified with each thought. Dionysus, listen to my plea. He shouted, his broken voice, full of despair. His words echoed on the golden walls, but no answer came. There was nothing, just the echo of his own shout, empty as everything he had done. The king had asked the power to convert everything that touched into gold, but had not considered that such power was a conviction. The desire for wealth had blinded his heart, and now, his daughter, his purest love, was trapped in a golden prison. How could I live with this? The nights were the hardest. Midas sat on his throne, looking at his daughter's statue, unable to look away. Every time I looked at her, the pain hit him more strongly. It had been his greed that had transformed her into gold, and now he was condemned to live with the consequences. His daughter could not return a smile, or take her hand. He couldn't laugh, or be the girl he had met. The silence in his palace was unbearable, heavier than any gold load. Why didn't you give me the wisdom, Dionysus? Why did you allow me to fall into this trap? Midas asked the vacuum, his tears falling on the cold golden surface. Each word was an echo of its regret. His pleas became more intense with every hour that passed. He could no longer sleep, he could not eat, he could not think of anything but his transformed daughter, in his own stupid and destructive desire. He got up from his throne, walked aimlessly through the palace, colliding with the gold columns, with the furniture that were previously symbols of his opulence, but who were now witnessing his loss. The golden brightness hurt him, as if every reflection clicked his heart. I just want it to be as before. I want to hear his voice. I want to see her run through the halls. Please, all this ends. Every corner of the palace surrounded him with memories of what had been. His daughter playing in the gardens, his laughs filling the air, his face illuminated by the sun. All that had disappeared. Everything had faded with the golden touch that he had wanted, and now, everything that was left was an empty life, stripped of meaning. In his despair, Midas tried to find a solution. He ran to the temple of Dionysus, imploring for help. Please, I beg you. Get rid of the damage I have done. Back to my daughter. I offer you everything I have, everything I am, but bring back the life that left my hands. But as in his palace, silence was the only answer. Dionysus, the god who had granted him this power, had abandoned it. There was no going back. The desire Midas was irreversible. I could no longer undo what I had done. He could no longer save his daughter. How can I live with this? Midas wondered, while tears fell once again. I wanted to be happy, I wanted to have everything, but at what price? There is no gold that can fill the void you have left in my heart, my daughter. His pleas became shouting, desperate regrets. He felt how his heart broke with each breath. Life no longer made sense to him without his daughter. The gold that had been his dream, his blessing, now was his conviction. The palace, the kingdom, all its power and wealth no longer meant anything. What served gold if he couldn't hug his daughter, if he couldn't hear his voice? Midas collapsed to his daughter's golden statue, his hands touching the cold surface once again. I was completely defeated. Forgive me, Marigold, he whispered in a trembling voice. Forgive me for what I did. I loved you so much, and this gold, this damn gold, has taken me everything. The king now cried with the despair of a man who had lost the most valuable. Every tear that fell on golden gold seemed to mark an end point to its history, a story that had begun with a desire that did not understand until it was too late. But now there was no way to return. His daughter was still caught in that golden form, and he, the richest king in the world, was the poorest man of all. Because gold, so brilliant and dazzling, could not return what I had really lost. The air of the palace of Midas felt dense, heavy with the anguish of the king, who no longer knew how to face his own curse. Every corner of the castle reflected its failure, with a golden brightness that flooded its life, but not its soul. His riches, which one day had given him a sense of pride and power, had become the greatest reminder of his despair. There was no comfort, there was no peace. Midas could no longer sleep. The nights were lengthened endless, and when he finally crumbled on his pillow, the only thing he saw were the faces of his daughter and his wife, transformed into gold. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cold statue of Marigold, his daughter, frozen in a smile that he could never experiment again. The golden beauty, the brilliance of the image, only accentuate the lack of life, the cruel irony of its desire. And it was in one of those dark nights, on the verge of madness, when Midas had the revelation, there was something he could do. A flash of hope, weak but persistent, shone in his mind. He had heard rumors about a sacred river, a river whose waters could purify any curse, return life to what had been touched by death. The Pactolo River, located far, in the remote mountains, could be the only way out. His heart thoroughly throbbed when thinking about that possible solution. If the waters of that river can undo what I have done, if I can reverse my sin, my daughter will return. Everything will return to normal, he thought, while his eyes shone with a spark of desperate hope. In his mind, his daughter's vision, restored and full of life, gave her strength to act. At dawn, Midas made the decision, he would leave at all costs, crossing mountains, valleys, and rivers, if necessary, until he reached the sacred river Pactolo. The doors of his palace opened with a squeak, and the king, without an army, without wealth, without company, left alone in search of the only salvation he had left. The first hours of his trip were an internal struggle, with fear thoughts and regret invading his mind. What if the river didn't work? What if the curse was irreversible? What if his daughter never returned? But for every doubt that arose, his heart gave him strength to move forward. I could not give up. I couldn't live knowing that I had lost the most precious thing. The trip was long and hard. Midas crossed dense forests, steep mountains, and turbulent rivers. Despite tiredness and pain, every step he approached him more to the hope that had shone in his mind. Inside, he felt that time was exhausted, that every second lost was an additional conviction. In his chest, fear and hope were intertwined, and his soul felt heavier than ever. One day, after several days of travel, he arrived at the banks of the Pactolo River. Water flowed with serene softness, glowing with an unusual glow. Midas, with his eyes full of tears, approached the shore and, without hesitation, immersed his hands in the crystalline water. He felt how the current caressed his skin, as if the river itself was recognizing its despair. But there was no immediate magic. There was no miracle at that time, only the whisper of the water that seemed to listen to his pain. With his hands still submerged in the water, Midas looked up at the sky. "Dionysia, please? I beg you. Help me. I can't live with this curse. I can't do losing my daughter. Return me what I have destroyed with my greed," he begged with all the strength of his soul. The wind began to blow strongly, stirring the waters of the river, and Midas felt a strange presence. A figure appeared before him, not in body, but in the form of a diffuse shadow. The king, exhausted by the trip, stared at that presence with his eyes full of despair. "You have come to look for redemption, Midas," said a deep and resonant voice, like the echo of the gods. "But the truth is that the curse you carry is part of you. The desire you asked was granted, but all power entails a price." Midas fell to his knees, his heart beating hard on his chest. "I don't care about the price. I would pay everything to return my daughter's life. Please do not leave me with this pain. I can't stand it." The shadow of God seemed to move with a support sigh, but the answer was clear. "Gold cannot return life, Midas. What you have done cannot be undone. But there is a lesson in all this, and it is the price of greed. The gold you have touched will become something else, the gold of wisdom, of humility. But you will only understand that when you free yourself from your desire." Midas felt that the weight of those words crushed it. Wouldn't there be salvation? Was everything lost? The anguish wrapped him, but, inside, something began to change. What had more to learn to live with his pain and with the lesson that was being taught? However, the river continued flowing gently, and on the horizon, something titled as a last hope. Midas did not know what future awaited him, but now he knew that his search was not only for redemption, but also for a deeper understanding of his own existence. And, perhaps, although his daughter could no longer return, he could still find something worth it. The sun was placed on the kingdom of Midas, staining the sky of gold and orange tones, as a mockery of the curse that had invaded his life. The afternoon brightness seemed to bounce in every corner of its palace, illuminating the walls covered with gold, golden furniture, the statues that previously represented the greatness of their empire. And yet, all that was empty. Vacuum like his heart, which he no longer beat with the same force as before, marked by pain and anguish. Midas was no longer the same man. It was not since his desire, his greed, had been satisfied so destructively. He remembered the day he had pronounced those words, those that escaped him as an thoughtless desire, as a child asking for more than he could handle. "Everything that touches will become gold," he had said with his eyes shining with greed, without understanding the price that would have. Now, looking around his kingdom, everything he saw were vestiges of a happiness that had never been real. The golden statues of his daughter, his wife, from his servers, shone in each room, but it was not gold that filled those spaces, but a deep and painful vacuum. His daughter, Marigold, was no longer by his side. And no matter how much he tried to touch her, hug her, restore her to life, the only thing she got was that her skin became even more cold and rigid. The tragedy was unwavering, like the gold he had played, which had become a prison that he could not escape. He closed his eyes, and his daughter's image invaded his mind again. That frozen smile, the eyes that once shone alive, now empty and fixed in eternity. If I could only go back in time, if I could have seen beyond temptation, beyond the thirst for power. If I could understand, as I understood now, that nothing in this world has value if what is really lost is what you love. Every day that passed, the internal struggle intensified. The greed, the one that had shaped his life for so long, no longer seemed like a desired treasure. It was a load, a shadow that pursued him. Midas could not escape her. His mind tormented him, and his heart no longer found rest. Every time he passed through the palace halls, the golden light reminded him of what he had done. Every time I saw a new gold statue, the weight of the fault sank more. And every time he looked at the Pactolo River, that river that had cheated him with promises of cure, felt the bitter reality that he could not undo what was already done. On an especially gloomy day, Midas was in his garden, watching the landscape that was once a place full of life. The flowers that grew on the bushes were no longer flowers, they were gold, rigid and dead statues. He looked at the trees, those who had someday had shadow and freshness, now they were golden trunks that did not move with the wind. The air was no longer fresh, everything seemed to be stopped, like the time itself. He knelt on the floor, among the golden flowers, and for the first time in a long time he cried. He cried for what he had lost, for the life he had destroyed, for the love that he could never feel again in the same way.
Why didn't I see what was really important?
He murmured, with his voice broken by pain.
Why did I let my desire blind me?
If I had only known. And at that moment, something changed inside him. It was as if all the weight of his greed was melting, crumbling slowly, like the gold he had desired so much. Midas finally understood that life was not about what could be possessed, what could be touched, but what could be given, what could be shared. He had learned, at a heartbreaking cost, that the true value of life lies in love and connections, in what one can offer, not what he can take. With the mind and heart clouded by repentance, Midas slowly rose from the ground. The scene of his daughter, of his family, began to fade slowly from his vision. Not because he wanted it, but because his approach was no longer in gold. He no longer saw the golden brilliance, but the darkness that had spread over his life due to his ambition. Gold was no longer his greatest desire, it was his forgiveness, his inner peace, what he needed most. But that peace would not come so easily. Midas knew that the path to forgiveness was long and that his fight against his own greed had only begun. He could no longer be the man who once was, nor could he be the king who ruled with iron hand. The only thing he could do now was to try to redeem the irremediable, to find some way of living with his tragedy without letting her consume it completely. That night, while the palace continued to resonate with the echo of his loneliness, Midas plunged into a restless dream. I no longer dreamed with riches, with power, or with the golden touch. He dreamed with his daughter, with Marigold, and for the first time in a long time, he saw in his dream a flash of light. It was not a brilliant gold, but a warm white, soft light that wrapped his daughter in a protective hug. In the dream, she smiled at her, but this time it was not a frozen or golden smile, it was a living smile, full of love. He woke up with wet eyes, but for the first time in a long time, something inside him changed. He knew that repentance could not erase everything, but in his heart he understood that the important thing was no longer the gold, but the love he could still give. The breeze was light that afternoon, like a caress that seemed to escape time. Midas walked only through the garden of his palace, whose golden walls now seemed to weigh more than ever. Every corner reflected the condemnation he had forged, gold, that damn gold that no longer brought him joy, only despair. His steps guided him, as if something invisible pushed him, towards the edge of the Pactolo River, which crossed the southern part of his kingdom. The water, the one that had heard so many times sing his stories, now seemed a distant whisper, almost indifferent. But something inside told him that maybe, just maybe, there he would find the answer. He recalled the old legends, those stories that the elders told around the fire, in which the Pactolo River had the power to reverse the golden touch of Dionysus. The rumor that the river waters could clean their curse had been mentioned several times, but Midas had never put too much faith in them. I thought that the solution would be more complex, than a curse as big as his could not be resolved so easily. but now, exhausted, with the soul broken by the tragedy of his daughter and the suffering of his own heart, something inside him drove him to look for one last hope, one that even he dared to name aloud. He approached the river cautiously, as if he feared that the waters could deny his hopes. The flow of water seemed a constant murmur, almost a sad song, as if the river also understood the despair of the man who approached his banks. Midas stopped for a moment, observing how water flowed between the stones, taking everything it touched. It was as if the river itself was aware of the load that the king carried in his heart, of the broken life that dragged behind him. Then, a thought toured his mind: what if I could really undo what I have done? What if the Pactolo waters can free me from this curse, from this golden load that consumes me? He knelt slowly next to the river, with his eyes fixed in the crystalline water that flowed before him. The sound of the river wrapped him, as a soft hug, as if he were inviting him to immerse him in him, to leave the past behind. However, it was not only the water that attracted him, but the promise of redemption that the legend brought. He knew that the only way to restore the lost, to save his daughter, to free himself from the terror of his own creation, was to find a solution in that river. But fear it was also present, a fear that made him fear that what he wanted was nothing more than a mirage, an illusion of salvation that could never be achieved. In that sea of doubts, Midas did not see that their fingers touched the water, that the river currents caressed it, that the waters seemed to respond to their presence, as if they were recognized in it. It was then that he felt the first change, as if the river was accepting it, as if his desire were known for nature itself. The water, which had always been calm, began to move more strongly, as if he wanted to reveal something. With his heart beating hard, Midas closed his eyes, fearing what could come. He could feel the weight of his own suffering, the burden of everything he had lost, as a pressure on his chest. But at the same time, something reassured him. The waters, cold and fresh, surrounded him, offered him a peace that he had not experienced in a long time. The murmur of the river became a clear, almost human whisper, and Midas heard a voice, or perhaps it was only his mind, which spoke to him from the depths: gold cannot heal your heart. Gold cannot return what you have lost. But Pactolo river water can free yourself from the curse you have brought on you. To reverse your desire, you must immerse yourself in my waters, purify your soul and your desire. And only then you can see the world as I did before greed blinded your eyes. Midas could not believe what he heard, but something in his being knew that the answer was in front of him. Water not only called him to heal his body, but to clean his soul. It was as if the river itself was a mirror that showed him what he had done, but also what could become: a man without the weight of his greed, a man who could feel again. The king immersed himself in the water, trembling not only for the cold, but for the uncertainty of what would come. The touch of gold had been his conviction, but now he felt that maybe, just perhaps, Pactolo's water could be his salvation. While the water covered him to his shoulders, he felt a slight feeling of relief. As if the river was cleaning it, not only of its curse, but also of its mistakes, of its regrets. Time seemed to stop. The murmur of the river became a distant song, a melody that wrapped it, lulled it. And at that time, Midas understood that gold he had wanted so strongly, was not what he should look for. Gold was just a superficial layer, a facade that had blinded it to the essential. And now, by immersing himself in the purifying water of the Pactolo, he felt that his heart began to heal. Although nothing was assured, and the future was still uncertain, Midas understood that perhaps, only perhaps, at the end of his painful journey, he could recover what he had lost. The curse of gold could break, but the real release would only come when he himself would free himself from the desire he had consumed. The Pactolo river, who had offered his help, now seemed to be the last chance he had left. And while remained there, surrounded by the waters, he felt a flash of hope, as dim but as real as a spark of light in the dark. Midas returned to the kingdom with the soul full of scars, the weight of its heavy guilt than any gold crown. The landscape around him had changed, as if the earth had felt the pain he carried inside. In its path, the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, as if nature recognized the tragedy that had been triggered by its own selfish desire. The king, formerly known for his splendor and pride, was now walked as a broken man, a king who had lost everything he once valued. His clothes, once glowing, were dazzled, stained by the traces of suffering. The people of his kingdom, who had admired his wealth and power, did not recognize him at all. Midas was no longer the man who had once made his fortune with the touch of gold. Now he was someone marked by a tragedy who had transformed him. The villagers, at first, looked suspiciously at their return, as if they were afraid that the same gold that had ruined him in the past could have followed him on his return. But soon, seeing the anguish on his face, they began to understand that this was not the king who had known glory. Midas walked without hurry towards his palace, his steps echoing in the empty streets, but inside, he felt he could not return in the same way. Greatness no longer made sense to him. Wealth had lost his power over his heart. Upon arriving at the gates of his palace, Midas stopped for a moment, observing the place that had been a symbol of his power, now wrapped in an atmosphere of loneliness and desolation. He remembered the days when the palace shone under the sun, reflecting its success, its control. But now, all that felt empty, like a dream that had lost its meaning. He entered slowly, without the glow of yesteryear, but with an internal determination that could not be ignored. He knew he had to face his people, although the words were stunned in his throat. He knew that he should apologize for what he had done, for the tragedy he had unleashed with his own desire. And he would, even if his heart was broken in 1,000 pieces. The first encounter with the inhabitants of the kingdom was uncomfortable. At first, no one dared to approach. Midas, feeling the weight of his guilt, walked between the crowd with his head down, as if the gold he had once covered was still on his shoulders. But then, a child approached, small and disarmed with the fear that adults felt towards him. He looked at him with an innocent curiosity, without completely understanding what had happened. Midas, with eyes full of sadness, he bent down and smiled at him, a sad but genuine smile. The child, speechless, touched it gently on his arm, as if he recognized the fragility of that man who had been the king. That simple action, the gesture of a child who did not completely understand Midas's suffering but, however, felt the need to offer comfort, touched the king's heart in a deep way. For a moment, Midas forgot about gold, the tragedy, and only felt the warmth of a simple, human gesture. It was that little act that reminded him that, although he had lost a lot, not everything was lost. The humanity of its people remained a light in their dark life. Over time, Midas began to find new ways to connect with his people. He was no longer the king who imposed his will, but a man who apologized, who recognized his mistakes. The stories that were told in their kingdom were no longer gold or wealth, but from the lesson that Midas had learned. Instead of material wealth, he began to distribute what really mattered: time, compassion, and a friendly hand. The villagers, at first reluctant, began to see him again, but no longer as the king of greed, but as a man who had paid a price too high for his own desire. Although he could never undo what he had done, Midas understood that his true wealth was not in gold or power, but in human relations, in the ability to forgive and be forgiven. Time passed, and the kingdom of Midas slowly began to heal. Although the scars of the tragedy would never completely disappear, the people learned to live with them, and Midas, for the first time in a long time, began to live with something that resembled peace. I no longer needed to feel complete. His soul, although marked by the loss, had been renewed, and that, finally, was what gave him true greatness. While walking among its people, Midas no longer saw the golden reflexes of the past. I saw smiles, looks of understanding and acceptance. He knew that his life would no longer be as before, but he had found a new purpose, teaching his people what really mattered. And so, the king, whose greed almost destroys it, found a path to redemption, not through riches, but through the simple humanity that connected him with his people. The kingdom of Midas, once glowing with the promise of an endless prosperity, had experienced a brutal and permanent transformation. Everything that had been golden, everything that had been admired, was now a gloomy reminder of the consequences of a desire that should never have been asked. The touch of gold, in his initial appearance of blessing, had become a curse that disrupted not only the life of his king, but that of his entire nation. At first, Midas had believed that gold would be the answer to all its problems. The streets of his kingdom, formerly simple and modest, now shone with the reflection of his greed. The columns of the palace shone under the sun, the statues of the gods seemed more great, and the market was filled with treasures that dazzled those who dared to look at them. The people who had once lived in hardship, under the yoke of poverty, now saw in amazement the richness that flowed from the hands of their monarch. However, this brightness hid a darkness that only the wisest, or the most afflicted, could see. The economy of the kingdom, which was previously based on the trade of grain, fabrics and other goods, began to change. The fields, artisan workshops, and local stores were no longer based on the production of essential goods, but on the brightness of gold. Midas, blinded by greed, left aside what he really kept his people living and prosperous: hard work, cultivation, and creation. Instead, the currency in his kingdom was gold, which, although apparently gave him value and wealth, in the background he was beginning to crumble everything. At first, the merchants and artisans celebrated the increase in wealth. But soon, the shortage of basic products began to become evident. Without a constant supply of grains, fabrics, and other consumer goods, the people began to suffer. The crops did not grow with the same abundance as before, because Midas's gold had obscured his vision and his priorities. What had once been a fertile and productive land became a metal desert, unable to nurture those who lived in it. The peasants, who depended on the earth to survive, began to see how their crops wilt, although Midas had given gold in abundance. There was no room for the harvest of fruits or cereals. Gold could not be sown, much less reap. The homes that previously depended on the sale of these products to feed their families were seen in trouble, because gold could not replace food. The earth, which had been its greatest treasure, was now empty and arid. Commerce also began to decline. Although gold circulated freely in the streets, the true merchandise that operated the market was scarce. The merchants, unable to offer what their clients really needed, began to leave their positions. The confidence in the kingdom decreased, and the economic system that Midas had known began to crumble. Gold, far from being a blessing, became a dead weight. The exchange houses, which used to be prosperous places, were filled with golden objects that nobody wanted to buy. The golden touch that he had granted to his kingdom, far from filling the coffers of the merchants with wealth, had condemned him to the poverty of the essential goods. And people, little by little, began to realize. The murmurs of discontent rose between the crowds that walked through the golden streets. Gold, which at first looked like a symbol of power and prosperity, now looked like a trap. People no longer saw in the treasures the promise of a better life, but a sign that something was terribly bad. The children, who previously played happy in the grain fields, now played with gold fragments, ignorant that this was not the gift that their king had believed. The atmosphere in the kingdom became tense and desolate. Wealth, which had previously been the source of joy, was now the focus of collective anguish. Human relations also changed. People stopped trusting each other because gold had begun to corrupt souls. Nobody wanted to share what he had, for fear of losing it. Friendships dissolved, family ties tensed, and the kingdom, once a place full of life and hope, became a place of loneliness and greed. Midas, locked in his palace, saw how his kingdom fell into dive. But the most painful thing was the gaze that his people threw him. It was not a look of admiration, as before, but a look full of resentment and fear. The king, who had been worshipped, was now responsible for a tragedy that affected everyone. Midas, inside, knew that he could not reverse what he had done. The damage was done, and his kingdom, which had previously been a symbol of prosperity, was now a shadow of what it had been. The tragedy of the golden touch had reached its maximum point. Midas had lost not only the meaning of its own kingdom, but the true essence of what it means to be a leader. Thus, while the kingdom of Midas sank into despair, its economy collapsed, and people began to see the truth behind the golden lie. Midas, not knowing what to do with his insatiable desire, contemplated inside the deep transformation he had caused. What initially seemed the greatest blessing, it had turned out to be a curse that razed everything in its path. The figure of Midas resonates through the centuries as a symbol of duality between excessive desire and the tragedy of not understanding the consequences of our actions. In Greek mythology, its history is not only that of a greedy monarch, but that of a man whose ambition overflowed the limits of human understanding, leading him to a destiny of suffering. Midas is not just a king in Greek myths, it is an archetype, a representation of the dangers inherent to greed, a warning whose echo has endured in collective consciousness. King Midas occupies a unique place in the pantheon of Greek mythology, being a more complex figure than it might seem to the naked eye. Often, he is remembered for his touch of gold, the curse that was granted by Dionysus, the god of wine and fun. However, in the broader context of myths, Midas is a figure that represents not only ambition, but also redemption and repentance, which makes it one of the most human stories within ancient mythology. Midas is part of a rich tradition of heroes and mythical figures that, like him, are destined to suffer the consequences of their desires. But what distinguishes him from other mythical figures is the universality of his experience. He is not a god or a half-wed being, he is a man, a mortal who, like any other, is dragged by the passions and errors of his heart. This feature makes it accessible to all, regardless of its time or place, which makes its history so moving. The relationship of Midas with Dionysus, the god who curses him, is key to understanding the place he occupies in the myths. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and liberation, is found in many legends as an unpredictable and capricious figure. His intervention in Midas's life is not only a punishment, but a lesson about the lack of moderation. Midas, in his selfishness and insatiable desire for more wealth, challenges the divine laws and the nature of the gods. His story, therefore, is not only that of a man dragged by his desire, but also that of a mortal who challenges the balance of life and, in doing so, faces the consequences of that transgression. The myth of Midas also has a fascinating connection with other mythical figures of ancient Greece. In the context of the famous war between Dionysus and the inhabitants of the region, Midas appears as a complex character. He is not simply a king who receives a blessing or a curse. His interaction with Dionysus shows a link between the human and the divine, where the gods play with the destinies of mortals, leading them to understand the lesson of humility. In many ways, Midas represents all human beings who, when reaching power or wealth, forget what really matters. Throughout mythology, Midas is also a figure that embodies the paradox between abundance and lack. Despite receiving the blessing of turning everything that touches into gold, the king is empty, unable to enjoy life or true love. Its history not only highlights the emptiness that can generate material wealth, but underlines the disconnection that is often generated when the focus of life moves from human well-being towards the accumulation of power and material goods. However, Midas is not just a tragic character. Its history is also marked by the possibility of redemption. When he regrets his desire and seeks a solution, his encounter with the Pactolo River leads to transformation, a symbolic act that connects human action with the divine order. Through this rite, Midas not only cleans the curse of its golden touch, but, when immersing itself in the waters of the river, a vision of purification and rebirth is offered. This act of humiliation and repentance shows that, despite its failure, Midas has the opportunity to start again, which makes it a figure that, although marked by its mistakes, is able to change. In terms of its place in the pantheon of myths and legends, Midas is a king whose name has transcended the framework of his own history. His myth has endured because he speaks of a timeless dilemma, the struggle between excessive ambition and the inevitable consequences of not understanding the limits of our desire. The history of Midas is an eternal reminder that the excessive desire not only destroys what we love, but deprives us of what we truly need. Today, King Midas is more than a mythical character. Its history is still alive in the teachings of generations that have learned from their mistakes. Every time we listen to his name, the echo of his tragedy resonates in our own lives, reminding us that gold cannot buy happiness, that greed can make dust what one day was gold. In Greek mythology, Midas is not just a king, it is a mirror of all of us, a warning that the dreams of wealth and power can end in a bitter loneliness. The myth of Midas is one of the most fascinating and complex stories of Greek mythology, and has been transmitted over the centuries through various versions and stories, each with its own nuance and focus. The story has been told by ancient authors such as Herodotus, Ovid, and Pausanias, among others, who have added their own interpretations to the myth. The variations of this myth show the different ways in which Greek culture understood issues such as greed, fatality, and the relationship between gods and mortals. Each version, although it maintains the central elements of history, offers a unique perspective that highlights different lessons and values. One of the best-known versions of the Midas myth comes from Ovid, in his work Metamorphosis. In his story, Midas is a king of Phrygia who receives from Dionysus, the god of wine, the blessing of converting everything he touches into gold. However, what at first seems like a divine gift was converted quickly in a curse when Midas touches his food, his drink and, worst of all, his daughter, turning her into a gold statue. Desperate, Midas asks Dionysus to revoke the gift, which leads God to order him to wash in the Pactolo River, whose waters flow with gold. Through this rite, Midas is released from his curse, but the lesson on greed and the consequences of foolish desires is recorded forever. On the other hand, Herodotus, the Greek historian, also mentions Midas in his history, although from a different point of view. Herodotus does not focus so much on the touch of gold, but on the relationship of Midas with the gods and with other kingdoms. In his story, Midas is a powerful king, but his story is more related to political interaction than with the search for wealth. Herodotus includes Midas in his narration about the relations between the peoples of Asia Minor and the Greeks, and even mentions the existence of a kingdom that prospered due to the generosity and wisdom of his ruler. Although the myth of Midas is more anecdotal in this context, the idea of a king who, through his ambition is maintained, faces difficulties, although without going into such fantastic details as those that Ovid presents. In the Pausanias version, the Greek traveler and geographer, the myth of Midas is intertwined with historical and cultural elements. Pausanias recounts the history of Midas in relation to the monuments and temples of Phrygia, highlighting the connection of Midas with the cult of the gods and the way in which their reign was seen by the inhabitants of the region. In his work Description of Greece, Pausanias refers to the Pactolo River as the place of liberation of Midas, but also mentions the importance of Phrygia as a land rich in myths, which not only focuses on the greed of its king, but on how this ruler was involved in the foundation of several religious temples and cults. Here, the myth of Midas is also a reflection on the relationship of humans with the gods, and how divine blessings can be transformed into curses when the balance between the two is lost. In addition to these classic versions, there are other narratives that also provide different perspectives on the myth of Midas. In some subsequent traditions, more simplified versions of the myth are presented, where the transformation of Midas into Gold Daughter is the point of greatest drama, while other stories focus on the humility and repentance of the king after having lost his greed. These versions tend to soften the story, giving it a more moralizing and didactic tone, destined to teach the audience that material desires do not always lead to happiness, and that wisdom and humility are the true riches of life. Each version of the myth of Midas reflects not only the differences of style and focus of the ancient authors, but also the various interpretations that Greek culture and their successors made on the universal issues of greed, regret, and divine intervention. Midas is not just a gold king, but a man who represents all mortals who, at times, thinks that power and wealth can solve all their problems, just to discover that those same desires can be their perdition. In this sense, the myth of Midas has a versatility that has allowed him to last over the centuries. The different versions of the myth show not only the ability of Greek mythology to adapt to changing circumstances and values, but also the timeless relevance of their lessons. The history of Midas remains a warning about the dangers of uncontrolled desire and the price of greed, a lesson that transcends the borders of ancient Greece and remains relevant today. The versions of the myth of Midas not only offer a variety of approaches, but also enrich the understanding of this legendary figure and its moral implications, making it one of the most shocking stories of classical mythology. The myth of Midas, with its powerful golden touch, has transcended the borders of ancient Greece to become one of the most universal and enduring stories in modern popular culture. The image of a king whose greed leads him to desire absolute power and gold has resonated over the centuries, adapting to different contexts and means. Today, Midas is not only a mythological figure, but a symbol that has influenced literature, cinema, art, and music, keeping alive the lesson of greed and its consequences. One of the most obvious ways of the presence of Midas in modern popular culture is through its inclusion in films, television series, and literary works. In literature, the name of Midas has been used symbolically to portray persons looking for wealth at all costs. For example, authors such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, in his story The Figure of Midas, explore the notion of golden touch as a metaphor of obsession with money and power, showing a character who, like the king Phrygia, he is consumed by his own desires and the lack of humanity in his search for wealth. In this case, myth becomes a reflection on the consequences of assessing money over the emotional and spiritual aspects of life. In addition, in cinematographic productions, the myth of Midas has been reinterpreted creatively. Many modern films have taken the idea of Midas to create characters that, like the mythological king, are involved in situations in which wealth gives them power but snatches what they value most, such as their happiness or personal relationships. Films like The Midas Touch or Goldfinger, by James Bond, have been influenced by the king's figure, using the concept of golden touch as a metaphor for the danger of obsession with money and control. In Goldfinger, the villain, although it is not measured directly, embodies the desire for power and wealth through gold, which becomes a modern reference to the classic myth. The symbolism of Midas is also evident in music, where the golden touch has been used in songs that explore the theme of greed and the difficulties that may arise when desire more than what is needed. From rock bands to pop artists, the name of Midas appears recurrently in letters that question the true nature of wealth and what really is worth it in life. The phrase "the touch of Midas" has become a commonly used term to describe those individuals who seem to have a fortunate touch in business or finance, but in some cases, this also implies the trap of losing the human essence in the process. In art, the figure of Midas has been reinterpreted in multiple ways. From paintings and sculptures in antiquity to contemporary works, the myth of Midas has been a constant source of inspiration for artists that explore the relationship between greed, power, and human fragility. Often, artists represent the golden touch of Midas visually impressive, showing characters transformed into gold, which reinforces the moral lesson that lies in the heart of the myth. These representations invite reflection on how desire for gold and wealth can dehumanize a person, transforming it into a cold and inert statue, disconnected from emotions and personal ties. Finally, the myth of Midas has also permeated the world of advertising and marketing. The term "a Midas touch" is often used to describe a person or entity that has a special talent to convert everything that touches into success. This concept is used by brands and companies that want to associate their products or services with the idea that they can lead to those who choose them. Although this use in modern popular culture of Midas moves away from the moral lessons of the original myth, it remains a manifestation of how the desire for wealth and success remains a powerful and attractive force in society. The myth of Midas has been so influential and adaptable that it is still relevant today, long after the old Greek stories were first told. Through its various interpretations in literature, cinema, art, and music, the myth of Midas has maintained its position as a powerful symbol of greed, serving as a warning about the dangers of pursuing gold to expenses of what really matters in life. The history of the king who wanted absolute power and wealth, only to discover that what he wanted most destroyed him, remains as shocking and relevant today as he was thousands of years ago in the lands of ancient Phrygia. In Greek mythology, greed is a recurring theme that is presented as a devastating human defect, capable of bringing to those who succumb to it. The ancient Greeks, with their rich tradition of mythological stories, created stories that not only sought to entertain, but also teach moral lessons through the mistakes of their heroes, gods, and kings. Within this context, greed is reflected as a corrosive force that not only affects those who suffer from it, but also its environment, leaving a trace of emotional, spiritual destruction and, often, physical. The myth of King Midas is, perhaps, the most emblematic example of greed in Greek mythology. Midas, asking everything that touched to become gold, demonstrated how the insatiable desire of wealth can eclipse the sensible judgment. His transformation of the world that surrounded him in a cold gold metal, it was not only a punishment for its excessive ambition, but also an illustration of the void that entails prioritizing material goods above human ties. Midas's tragedy lies in the fact that, when reaching his most coveted desire, he lost what really mattered: contact with his daughter, the pleasure of a simple meal, and the warmth of human relationships. However, Midas is not the only character that exemplifies greed in Greek myths. Another iconic story is Erysichthon, a man who carved a sacred forest dedicated to Demeter to build an excessive banquet, ignoring divine warnings. As punishment for his greed and lack of respect for nature, Demeter condemned him to an insatiable hunger. The more he ate, the more voracious he turned, until he finally devoured everything he possessed and even himself. This history, brutal in its outcome, not only condemns greed, but also the lack of moderation and contempt for natural forces. Even the gods, despite their immortality and power, were not exempt from greed and its consequences. Zeus, often represented as the supreme god of Olympus, showed several times an insatiable desire for power and control, which led him to make decisions that triggered wars and sufferings. On one occasion, to prevent humans from reaching divinity, Zeus hid the fire, an act that symbolized his desire to maintain his position of superiority. Prometheus, by challenging this greed and returning the fire to humanity, became a tragic hero who suffered an eternal punishment for his act of generosity. The ancient Greeks also associated greed with hybris, or excess, arrogant and excessive behavior that challenged divine laws and caused the wrath of the gods. This concept is reflected in numerous myths, such as Icaro, who, blinded by his ambition to fly higher, ignored the warnings of his father Daedalus and fell into the sea as he approached the sun too close. Although it is not about material greed, this story shows how excessive desire to achieve more than allowed can lead to self-destruction, a lesson that is intertwined with the conviction of greed in its broadest sense. Greed also manifests itself in myths related to the Trojan War, where desire for power, honor, and material goods led to one of the most epic confrontations of Greek mythology. Agamemnon, leader of the Greeks, showed an excessive greed by insisting on staying with the Breseda slave, which caused the anger of Achilles and triggered a chain of events that almost led to the defeat of the Greeks. In this case, greed was not only a personal defect, but a catalyst for conflicts and collective suffering. The representation of greed in Greek mythology is not limited to moral warnings, but also reflects the concerns of the society of the time. In a culture where material wealth was intrinsically linked to power and status, myths served as a constant reminder of the dangers of excessively assessing material goods and forgetting the principles of moderation, balance, and respect for others. Greed in Greek myths was not only a human weakness, but a mirror of the social, political, and spiritual tensions of ancient Greece. For human relations, moderation, and respect for the world around us. The balance between desire and moderation has been a central theme in Greek mythology, an inexhaustible source of stories that reveal the dangers of exceeding in the search for power or pleasure. The ancient Greeks firmly believed in the importance of saphrosyne, a concept that represents moderation, temperance, and self-control, essential qualities to live a virtuous life. When this balance is broken, either by ambition, greed, or unbridled desire, the consequences are usually devastating. Myths serve as vivid warnings of the costs of ignoring this fundamental virtue. The myth of Midas is perhaps one of the most powerful examples of the lack of moderation. His desire to transform everything that touched into gold did not arise from need, but from an excessive ambition. When obtaining his desire, Midas not only separated from the simple pleasure of enjoying a meal or touching their loved ones, but also condemned to an empty existence, surrounded by wealth that lacked meaning. Midas' tragedy shows us that even the most desired gifts can become curses if they are not used in moderation and wisdom too. Another shocking example of the dangers of excess is found in the figure of Icaro. His desire to fly higher and challenge the limits imposed by his father, Daedalus, led him to his loss. Icaro did not understand that power without control is not freedom, but a trap that inevitably leads to disaster. By ignoring his father's warnings, Icaro lost the opportunity to enjoy the experience of the flight and, instead, he found death. This myth not only illustrates the dangers of excess, but also underlines the need to listen to the wisdom of those who have learned to value balance. Prometheus' story also addresses the issue of excessive power, although from a different perspective. By stealing the fire to deliver it to humans, Prometheus challenged Zeus and the divine laws, believing that his act was noble and necessary. However, his decision, although altruistic, unleashed a chain of sufferings for both humanity. Prometheus's punishment, chained to a rock while an eagle devoured his liver daily, symbolizes the consequences of breaking the balance between power and respect for superior forces. Its history raises deep questions about the limits of ambition and the cost of challenging what is established. The dangers of excess are also reflected in the tragedies of characters such as Agamemnon, whose arrogance and lack of moderation triggered conflicts that affected not only him, but all around him. By insisting on maintaining his power and dominion even when he meant sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia, Agamemnon showed how the excessive desire for control can destroy what one more values. Its history serves as a reminder that power, when sought without limits, can lead to a life of loneliness and repentance. Even the Greek gods, despite their immortality and power, were not exempt from the dangers of excess. Zeus, for example, often showed an inclination to exercise his authority in an excessive way, which caused tensions both in Olympus and between mortals. However, we are also shown that even the gods could learn lessons about the importance of moderation. In some myths, the gods who exceeded their possession faced punishments or humiliations that reminded them of the limits inherent in their divine condition. Greek mythology teaches us that the balance between desire and moderation is not only a personal virtue, but also a principle that governs the universe. Hybris, or excess, was seen as a transgression that inevitably attracted nemesis, or remuneration. This principle was not only a moral warning, but a universal truth that reflected the belief of the Greeks in cosmic harmony. When someone broke this balance, it was already a king, a hero, or even a god. The forces of the universe were responsible for restoring it, often at a very high cost. Ultimately, lessons on the dangers of excess power and desire in Greek mythology are not only ancient stories, but timeless teachings that resonate today. They remind us that true strength does not reside in obtaining everything we want, but knowing when to stop. Manage our impulses, value what we have, and recognize the limits of our power are the foundations of a full and significant life. Like Midas, Icaro, and so many other mythical characters, we all face decisions that put us to the test, and only when cultivating moderation we can avoid the mistakes that would lead us to ruin. Midas, the king who seemed to have everything, learned in the hardest way that wishes do not always bring happiness. The idea of turning everything into gold with a simple touch seemed like a perfect dream, but quickly became a nightmare that cost him more than he would never have imagined. This Greek myth is not only a warning about the dangers of greed, but also a deep reflection on the price of unworthy desires and the consequences of our decisions. The moment Midas asked Dionysus for his desire was an instant of greed disguised as an opportunity. He did not stop to consider the real implications of what he asked. The promise of infinite wealth clouded his judgment, and the idea of absolute power over matter seemed irresistible. But this desire, apparently harmless, hid a devastating cost that would not only affect Midas, but also his kingdom and his family. The first bitter lesson came with hunger. What was previously a delicating banquet was now transformed into pure gold on contact with his hands. Each piece of bread, each glass of wine, became a bright but useless object. At that time, Midas understood the harsh reality: you can't eat gold. What he had desired with so much fervor now condemned him to starve, surrounded by rich who could not support their lives. But the tragedy did not end there. The golden touch of Midas was not limited to inanimate objects. The flowers that adorn the gardens of the palace, the water currents that flow through their kingdom, even the warm hugs of their loved ones, everything was caught in that brilliant curse. It was at the moment that he accidentally touched his daughter when the reality of the price of his desire hit with all his strength. What was once pure love and paternal tenderness became a cold and motionless statue, an eternal reminder of its imprudence. Midas's desire not only destroyed his personal life, he also had repercussions on his kingdom. The peasants who previously worked in the fields found themselves unable to plough the land, since even work instruments became gold. The sources, which used to supply the people, frozen in a metal flow. The gold, which symbolized wealth and prosperity, now brought suffering and despair to all corners of its territory. This story reminds us that impulsive desires, when they are fulfilled without thinking, usually bring unexpected consequences. Midas's desire was not bad in himself, but his inability to anticipate the implications of having such an absolute power was his greatest mistake. In life, desires can become traps when they are not evaluated carefully. Often, what we believe will bring us happiness can end up destroying what we value most. Greek mythology, in its essence, seeks to teach us deep lessons through stories loaded with symbolism. The price that Midas paid for his desire was not only his own anguish, but also the loss of what gave meaning to his life, his connection with others, and with the natural world. This myth not only criticizes greed, but also invites us to reflect on how our decisions can affect those around us. The consequences of unworthy desires are not exclusive to myths. In real life, many times, we look for quick solutions or pursue objectives without considering the long-term impact. We become obsessed with the idea of more money, more power, more success, without stopping to think if that more will really make us happier or if it will only move us away from what really matters. The history of Midas resonates because, deep down, we have all had moments when we want something with such intensity that we do not stop to evaluate the possible consequences. However, wisdom lies in learning from these errors, recognizing that each decision has a price and to be aware of whether we are willing to pay it. Midas, in his despair, begged Dionysus to take away the gift he had previously longed for with so much fervor. This act of repentance shows that even the worst decisions can open the door to a personal transformation. But not all stories have happy endings, and it is not always possible to undo the consequences of our actions. Therefore, the real lesson is to think before desire, to reflect before acting and assessing what we have before looking for more. The myth of Midas is a mirror that reflects our own struggles with desire and satisfaction. It reminds us that true wealth is not in material things, but in connections, experiences, and the ability to enjoy what we already have. The price of unworthy desires can be high, but it can also be an opportunity to learn, grow, and reassess what really matters in life. Midas, the king who once dreamed of unlimited power, found himself on his knees at the harsh reality of his own ambition. Life, which seemed before him a board where he could move the pieces at will, showed him that true greatness does not lie in control, but in the ability to recognize one's limitations. Its history, marked by the brightness of gold, ended up covering itself with a veil of humility that no earthly power could start. When Midas begged Dionysus to free him from his curse, he did not do it as a haughty king, but as a shattered man. At that time, he understood that the wealth and the power he had wanted so much could not buy what really mattered. His pride, that internal voice that told him that he deserved more, crumbled like a sand castle in the face of the implacable force of the waves. He was no longer a monarch that gave orders, he was a father full of guilt, a man who had lost the most valuable because of his insatiable greed. The Pactolo River, with its waters that dragged the golden curse, not only cleaned the body of Midas, but also its soul. As he immersed his trembling hands in the current, he felt how the weight of his error slid along with the gold that dyed the water. It was not just a physical act, it was an atonement ritual, a silent confession before the nature that reminded him of his fragility. For the first time in his life, Midas felt what meant being vulnerable, which meant being a human. But humility did not arrive immediately, he forged in the days and nights of loneliness that followed. Every corner of his palace told him what he had lost, the empty echo of the golden rooms, the metal flowers that would never bloom again, the empty place at the table where his daughter used to sit. Those silences, more than any reprimand, taught him a lesson that no wise or God could impart. True wealth is not to possess, but to value. The people of Midas also had to learn to see their king with new eyes. He was no longer the ruler who promised endless wealth, but a man who had made a monumental mistake. However, in their humility they found something more valuable than gold, the ability to accept their failures and seek redemption. Midas, recognizing their mistakes publicly, became a symbol of learning and change. His fall was not only his, it was a collective reminder that arrogance always has a price. Over time, the king began to rebuild his kingdom not with riches, but with acts of generosity and compassion. He visited the fields, spoke with the peasants and shared with them the lesson that life had taught him. He was no longer looking to dominate the world with his power, but to understand it from the perspective of those who lived it. In that closeness with his people, he found a new way of governing, one that did not depend on the brightness of gold, but on the force of human relations. Midas learned that humility is not only to accept that one is not perfect, but also be willing to change. It is to look at the past without resentment, but with the determination not to repeat the same errors. It is understanding that mistakes, although painful, can be powerful teachers if their lessons are heard. And it is to recognize that power and wealth are ephemeral, while goodness and humility transcend time. The brands of the past never disappeared completely. Gold still shone in Pactolo's waters as an eternal reminder of his mistake. But instead of seeing it with shame, Midas learned to see that brightness as a warning and a promise, the warning of what happens when the ambition is uncontrolled, and the promise that it is always possible to change, even when everything seems lost. The lesson of humility that Midas led not only transformed his life, but also left a mark on those who heard their history. The king who once believed that he deserved everything now understood that life is not measured by what one possesses, but for how he faces the challenges and errors. In his humility, Midas found a greatness that no golden touch could grant. And in his repentance, he found the true path to redemption. Midas's sacrifice began at the time he understood the weight of his actions. The king, who once believed that his desire to turn everything into gold was a divine gift, now he saw him as a curse that had destroyed everything he loved. With the heart loaded with guilt, he understood that he was not enough to regret, he had to act, even if that meant facing his own pride and pain. Midas knew that no act of redemption would be enough to return to his daughter or undo the suffering he had caused. However, at the bottom of his soul, he found the strength to do what few kings would do, renounce his crown and wealth in favor of a greater purpose. His sacrifice was not simply material, it was the act of recognizing his humanity, his fragility, and his desire to reconcile with others and with himself. The path to redemption was arduous. Midas left behind the splendor of his palace, now reduced to a golden mausoleum that reflected his past greed, and entered the fields of his kingdom. There, among the peasants who worked tirelessly to make a living, the king began to understand the true value of the effort, the community, and gratitude. These were things that could not buy with gold, and that for a long time he had taken for granted. Day after day, Midas worked with his people. He planted seeds, repaired tools, and shared the stories of his mistakes with a sincerity that moved those who listened to him. His transformation was not only a sample of humility, but a demonstration of his commitment not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Although many initially looked at him with distrust, over time, the hearts of his people began to soften. They saw in him a genuine man, not the haughty king who had ever ruled since his golden throne. Despite his effort to repair what he had destroyed, Midas could never escape the pain that accompanied him. Every night, in the solitude of his humble cabin, his daughter's tragedy revived. His image, frozen in gold, was a reminder the constant of what I had lost. But even in that pain, he found a spark of hope. If his story could serve as a warning for others, if he could prevent someone else from falling into the rage trap, then his sacrifice would not have been in vain. The true moment of redemption came when Midas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. In front of the Pactolo River, where he had once washed his curse, he decided to dedicate his days to protecting that source of life for future generations. He created a sanctuary around the river, prohibiting the exploitation of its resources and making sure that the water flows free and clean. The river, which had witnessed its transformation, now became a renewal symbol for the entire kingdom. Rumors about the change of Midas began to spread beyond the borders of their kingdom. For land travelers arrived to listen first to the history of the king who had renounced everything for a greater purpose. Although many came looking for gold that allegedly lay in the river, they went with something much more valuable, a lesson about the importance of assessing the intangible. Midas's fighting struggle was not perfect or free from obstacles. There were days when he felt consumed by the weight of his past, moments when he wanted to change the irreversible. However, every act of generosity, every gesture of empathy, was another step towards reconciliation with its people and with themselves. In his sacrifice, he found a way of healing, not only his kingdom, but also his soul. Midas understood that redemption is not a destination that is reached, but a path that is traveled every day. It is the will to face the past, to accept the consequences of their own mistakes and fight, even in the darkest moments, for doing good. And although his life was never again as before, in his sacrifice he found a peace that no wealth could have granted him. The day Midas decided to intervene in an issue that transcended human abilities was the beginning of a story full of pride and consequences. It all began with a musical judgment, a dispute between two gods that not only embodied art, but also rivalry and perfection in their divine expression: Apollo, the god of music, and Bread, the god of shepherds and forests. Each represented opposite worlds, and fate wanted me to be there to witness it. The air was loaded with expectation. In the center of the forest, the gods and mortals had gathered to decide who had the real dominance over music. Bread, with its rustic rod flute, offered a melody that resonated with nature, a sound that evoked the roots of the earth. Apollo, with his golden lyre, created such sublime harmonies that it seemed that the skies themselves bowed to listen to him. It was a confrontation of styles, worlds, ideologies. Midas, who had already known closely the consequences of his excessive wishes, should have remained silent, contemplating the greatness of that moment. But something inside, perhaps his stubborn spirit or a desire to reaffirm his worth, led him to take sides. When Apollo touched his lyre, everyone was hypnotized, except Midas. He, delighted by the simplicity and closeness of bread music, proudly proclaimed that the god of the forest was the true winner. The forest was filled with murmurs. The other judges, divine and mortal, watched in amazement how Midas challenged general opinion and, worse, contradicted the god Apollo. The anger of the god of the sun soon manifested. With a look that seemed to cross Midas's soul, Apollo approached him. "If you love what is rustic and primitive, then I will make your ears reflect your judgment," he said in a cold voice. Before Midas could answer, he felt a change in his body. A strange heat invaded his ears, and when he raised his hands to touch them, he discovered with horror that they had become donkey ears. The humiliation was immediate and devastating. The king, who had ever been known for his wealth and power, now carried a visible symbol of his lack of judgment and arrogance. Midas tried to hide his shame. He used turbans and high crowns to hide his donkey ears, but shame was something that not even the finest silks could cover. Only his closest servants knew his secret, and still, the weight of the latent mockery was unbearable. Every time he listened to laughs in the halls of his palace, he shuddered, convinced that they laughed at him. It was a punishment not only physical, but psychological, a constant reminder of its place in front of the gods. But, as in each story of Midas, this episode did not run out of your lesson. The donkey's ears not only isolated it from others, but also forced him to reflect on his own nature. It did that the trial is not only a matter of personal preference, but of sensitivity to know how to appreciate what is bigger than oneself. In his attempt to challenge divine perfection, Midas had shown blindness that now cost him more than anything else. The story, however, does not end only with punishment. Midas, despite his shame, learned to live with his ears. He became more humble, more reflective, and perhaps even wiser. In each act of humility, at all times when he remembered his place in the great scheme of life, the ears he hated so much became a reminder that greatness does not reside in challenging the gods, but in understanding the beauty of what we cannot achieve. The figure of Midas, although unique in its particular history of desire and suffering, shares certain parallels with other great mythological kings of ancient Greece, whose decisions deeply marked the course of their destinations and that of their peoples. Among these monarchs, figures such as Creon, Agamemnon, and others stand out, whose stories follow the same path of power, fateful decisions, and the inexorable connection between pride and suffering. Creon, the king of Thebes, is a figure that also, like Midas, is involved in the consequences of his own pride and excessive confidence in his judgment. Creon is mainly known for his rigid posture in the tragedy of Sophocles, Antigone. In his eagerness to impose order and enforce the law, I create his own niece, Antigone, to die for disobeying the order not to bury his brother, which unleashes a series of tragedies. As Midas, his greed and his excessive will to control everything that surrounds him leads him to a catastrophic fall. The death of his son Haemon and his wife Eurydice are the punishments that life imposes, a lesson that excess power and pride over family and humanity can bring devastating consequences. Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek forces in the Trojan War, presents another interesting comparison. Although his story is better known for his participation in the war and his sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia in the altar to appease the gods, the fatality that accompanies his life keeps similarities with that of Midas. Agamemnon, like the king of Phrygia, is involved in the drama of family decisions and the wrath of the gods. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, a decision taken to obtain victory in Troy, causes the fury of his wife Clytemnestra, who murders him on his return. In this sense, both Midas and Agamemnon suffer from wrong decisions, taken in times of pressure and desire to maintain power or get a victory. Both kings, in the end, are victims of the inability to see beyond their own interests, which leads them to lose the most valuable, to their loved ones and their own life. While Midas and these other monarchs share a direct relationship with fateful power and decisions, there is also a key difference that defines their respective stories. While Midas faces a divine punishment due to their insatiable desire for wealth, both Creon and Agamemnon acts based on their responsibility as rulers, being their decisions more about justice, duty, and war than about selfishness or pure greed. However, in all these mythological figures, the fall remains the same: arrogance before the gods and the inability to measure the consequences of their actions condemns them. The mythological kings, such as Midas, Creon and Agamemnon are representations of the dangers inherent to the excessive search for power, wealth, or control. Throughout their stories, decisions that seem to be logical or necessary, both from the political and personal point of view, result in tragedies that completely disrupt them. Greek mythology, as in the case of Midas, shows that excess, greed and abuse of power are dangerous vices, whose inevitable consequence is the loss of the most essential: humanity, family, and love. In the end, the destinations of these kings not only teach us about the fallacies of absolute power, but also about human fragility and the lessons that tragedies leave us. The connection between Midas and these other mythological kings lies in their internal struggle between the need to be great rulers and the consequences of lack of moderation and lack of vision about what really matters. The touch of gold of Midas, with its devastating and fascinating power, not only appears in the history of the king of Phrygia, but its essence is subtle but impressive in various myths and stories, both within the Greek mythology and in other traditions. Although King Midas is the main protagonist of this story, the concept of touch of gold, or the desire or obtaining uncontrollable wealth, is found in other myths, showing how power, greed, and the consequences of excessive desires are universal issues that are going through different cultures. In Greek mythology, one of the stories closest to the myth of Midas is that of King Midas and his daughter. Although Midas is the main figure of the story we know, there are other versions of the myth in which his daughter plays a more prominent role. In some of these versions, Midas's daughter is not only turned into gold by her father, but also presents itself as a symbol of the king's tragedy. In certain stories, the daughter becomes an object of love and worship, which increases the suffering of Midas, since she realizes that, trying to obtain wealth and power, she has lost what she loved most in life, her own family. This parallel with other mythological figures that suffer the consequences of their desires becomes a lesson on the importance of assessing the intangible above the material. The myth of Phaeton and the desire for absolute power also crosses the narrative of Midas. Phaeton, son of the god Helios, wants to drive the car of the sun through heaven, an ambition too great for a mortal. His lack of control and his desire to emulate divine greatness leads him to a fatal fall. Although it is not a touch of literal gold, the story of Phaeton reflects the same lesson as the myth of Midas: power and desire without limitation are not only unattainable, but can be destructive. Both stories share a clear warning about the consequences of wanting something beyond our abilities, whether gold or control over the sun. In addition, the myth of Ares and its excessive power can also be related to the desire to obtain more. Ares, the god of war, is known for his unstoppable thirst for violence and conquest. In some stories, his greed for power leads him to situations where, as Midas, the consequences of his wishes drag him into despair. Although there is no touch of gold in the myth of Ares, the idea of an uncontrollable and destructive power is present in the stories of its irrational behavior during battles, in which it ends up causing more chaos than benefit. Like Midas, Ares faces the consequences of his actions, being finally defeated and humiliated, which reflects how excess desire can lead to ruin. Outside Greek mythology, other cultures have also explored stories similar to the myth of Midas. In Roman mythology, the concept of excessive desire for gold and wealth appears in the history of Midas and the Pactolo River, which is not only a Greek myth, but is also known in Roman culture. However, history acquires a new dimension when it is related to the concept of fortune and chance. In Roman legends, Midas is seen as a king who cannot control his own wishes and that, seeking wealth, faces a fate that finally turns against him. In the Hindu tradition, there is a similar myth that involves Kubera, the god of wealth. Kubera, unlike Midas, has much greater control over its wealth, but its history also involves a warning about greed. Through his desires to accumulate more power and gold, Kubera is dragged into a cycle of suffering, as well as Midas. Although the touch of gold is not literal in this myth, the insatiable desire of wealth and the suffering that entails is a common theme that links both stories. In the Arab traditions and the stories of Aladino, the power of desire is reflected in the concept of the magic lamp, where the genius grants desires, but often the wishes are fulfilled in unexpected and harmful ways. Although it is not a touch of gold, Aladdin's desire for wealth and power brings more problems than solutions, which shows that excessive desires, even in a magical context, always have a price. This type of story shares the essence of the myth of Midas, remembering that what seems like a gift can become a curse. In summary, the myth of Midas and its touch of gold is not an isolated story, but is deeply rooted in the universal mythological culture. Whether through the stories of kings such as Creon and Agamemnon, gods such as Apollo and bread, or myths of other cultures, the touch of gold reflects the same principle: greed, desire for power or excessive wealth, and the consequences that entails. The versions vary, but the message remains constant: desire without moderation can even destroy the most powerful and wise. In Roman mythology, the figure of Midas is mainly integrated through the stories that the Romans inherited from Greek mythology, but with some nuances that reflect the peculiarities of Roman culture and thought. Although the myth of Midas he has the same weight and prominence in the Roman tradition as in the Greek, the Romans adopted the history of the king of Phrygia, especially his gold headdress, and incorporated him into his own cultural imaginary, giving him a new interpretation. The first point to highlight is that, for the Romans, Midas represented the unbridled greed and the insatiable search for material wealth, two aspects that Roman society considered dangerous. In his stories, Midas looked like a tragic figure that served as a warning about the dangers of excessive desire. However, the Romans not only saw Midas as a simple greedy king, but also interpreted him as a symbol of the excesses of power and fortune. Its touch of gold, in that context, became a moral issue about the value of moderation, something much appreciated in Roman culture. Unlike the Greeks, who offered more complex theological explanations about divine curses and blessings, the Romans tended to simplify and adapt moral lessons in a practical framework. In Roman stories, Midas not only suffered the consequence of his desire, but also served as an example of what could happen to anyone who put his blind faith in material wealth, without considering human or spiritual costs. One of Midas's best-known stories in Roman mythology is the version of the Pactolo River. In this myth, Midas is portrayed as a character who, after regretting his desire to have everything he touched into gold, seeks a way of getting rid of his curse. The solution comes when it is told that it is immersed in the Pactolo River, whose waters have the power to eliminate the curse. In the Roman version, the Pactolo River is not only a place of purification, but also a symbol of natural wealth that, although generous, is not exempt from danger. The river, through its connection with wealth, reinforces the lesson on the transience of money and the importance of not being dominated by greed. Over the centuries, the myth of Midas was also reflected in the literary and philosophical works of Imperial Rome, especially in the writings of authors such as Ovid, who collected many of the Greek myths in his work Metamorphoses. In this context, Midas appears more as a tragic character that not only regrets his desire, but is also caught by a series of irreversible consequences. Ovid, in particular, explores the figure of Midas to illustrate how excessive desire can result in an irreparable loss, not only of the king's humanity, but also of its relationship with the divine. The Roman author uses the myth to criticize the temptation of power and wealth, which must always be managed with humility. The figure of Midas also appears in the Roman philosophical reflections on virtue and vice. The Romans, influenced by the teachings of philosophers such as Seneca, Cicero, and Epicteto, saw in the history of Midas a clear example of how the excessive search for wealth can strip a person of their virtue. The Roman philosopher Seneca, in his letters to Lucilio, indirectly mentions the myth of Midas by reflecting on the importance of moderation and how greed can corrupt even the most powerful. In this sense, Midas was not only a greedy king, but also an example of what happens when moral vision is lost for the sake of material wealth. As for their relationship with the gods, in Roman mythology Midas is generally portrayed as a character who, despite his desire to have all the gold in the world, faces the gods differently than in Greek mythology. While in the Greek stories Midas is a king who receives the blessing of Dionysus and becomes a victim of it, in the Roman versions there is a more gloomy perception about his relationship with the divine. Midas is seen as a man who, not knowing how to handle his desire correctly, is punished by the gods not only as a lesson of humility, but also as a reminder that the gods have the last word about human fortune. Finally, in Roman culture, Midas's myth was used as a tool to teach lessons about moderation and the importance of not being a slave to material wealth. The history of the king who asks for more and more gold, only to realize that this same gold destroys it, resonated in Roman morals that valued simple life and virtue as the path to true happiness. In this way, the Romans took the history of Midas and adapted it to their own ethics, giving it a more pragmatic turn, but maintaining the message that true wealth lies in moderation, self-control, and humility before the gods. In short, although the Romans did not have such a central version of Midas like the Greeks, the myth of the king who requested the golden touch was appropriate by Roman culture as a moral example of the dangers of greed and wealth. Midas, like other mythological characters, became a symbol of the lessons that the Romans wanted to convey on human vices and virtues, consolidating itself as a character who illustrated how excessive desire can bring devastating consequences. The relationship between Midas and satyrs is one of the most curious and enriching aspects of the myth, revealing a fascinating contrast between the power of the king and the primitive and wild nature of the satyrs. In this context, Midas, a monarch famous for his greed and his tragic desire to turn everything into gold, is involved in a world where nature and mythical beings act outside the norms of human civilization. It is this interaction between the order of the kingdom of Midas and the chaos represented by the satyrs that shapes some of the most interesting episodes in their history. The best-known connection between Midas and satyrs comes from a very specific event that appears in several stories of Greek mythology, the famous musical judgment between Midas and the god Apollo. During this trial, Midas, as king, is surrounded by satyrs who play a fundamental role in the context of their relationship with music and nature. The satyrs, known for their love for music, wine, and excessive festivities, have a direct connection with Apollo, the god of music, who is considered the maximum exponent of musical art in Olympus. In this trial, Apollo organizes a musical competition in which he challenges a satyr named Marsyas, who dared to challenge God. Despite the magnificence of Apollo's musical talent, Marsyas, a satyr, interprets his music with passion and skill, which attracts Midas's attention. In this trial, Midas, as a judge, makes an election that will mark his destiny. He decides to continue with the purity and perfection of Apollo's art. This act of judgment, however, is not without consequences. Apollo, furious for Midas's decision, punishes him in a humiliating way. He grants him the gift of ass ears. From that moment on, King Midas must hide his ears deformed under a layer, since he became a symbol of his lack of discernment by valuing satyrs' music over that of a god. Through this episode, satyrs present themselves as beings that represent uncontrolled nature and uninhibited life, while Midas, as king, symbolizes order and civilization. However, despite its power, Midas is defeated in this trial for the most basic instincts and passions that the satyrs embody. This relationship between Midas and satyrs, although apparently comic, shows the tension between human civilization and wild nature, between order and chaos. Midas, a man of power, is unable to recognize beauty in the natural and the instinctive, which finally leads him to humiliation. In addition to this anecdote related to the musical judgment, satyrs also have a constant presence in stories related to Midas due to the proximity of these mythological beings to nature and the primitive senses that attracted Midas so much. Satyrs, half beings and half horses or goats, are known for their love for festivities and sensory pleasures, especially music, wine, and dance. This free and unbridled lifestyle is contrasted with the behavior of Midas, whose obsession with gold away from the simple and natural pleasures of life. Through this interaction, the myth of Midas with satyrs reinforces the notion that excessive human desires can get away from the true essence of life. The myth of Midas and satyrs also presents a reflection on the relationship between the beauty of the natural and the desire for human control. The satyrs, with their free and unpredictable nature, represent an aspect of life that Midas cannot control, and their interaction with them becomes a metaphor for the struggle between human greed and the need to accept the uncontrollable, the organic and the imperfect. In summary, the relationship between Midas and the satyrs is not only limited to the episode of the musical judgment, but extends throughout the king's narrative. The satyrs, with their connection with nature and music, are an external force that defies the rules and expectations of Midas, revealing the fallacy of their desire for absolute power and control over wealth. Through their relationship with satyrs, Midas faces their own inability to understand the value of the natural and or essential, which finally leads him to suffer the consequences of his own pride and greed. The myth of Midas has been a constant source of reflection for Greek philosophers, who used it as a moral lesson about the dangers of greed, excessive desire, and the struggle for balance in life. Through their interpretations, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle offered a critical look at the myth, unraveling the lessons that Midas embodies and suggesting how its history relates to ethics, morality, and human nature. Plato, the philosopher who always sought the ideal of good and justice in his writings, saw in the myth of Midas a warning about the danger of selfish desires seeking personal satisfaction without taking into account the common good. For Plato, Midas's desire for having the power to turn everything into gold symbolized a type of greed that was not only destructive to the individual, but also for society as a whole. The transformation of everything that touched into gold, although it seems a wonderful gift, is actually a curse that deprives him of everything that really matters, such as love, friendship, and the ability to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. In his dialogues, Plato highlights the importance of moderation and self-control as fundamental virtues to achieve internal harmony. According to him, the greed and the search for power, as Midas exemplifies them, are destructive impulses that unleash chaos both in the individual and in society. The myth of Midas is a metaphor of what happens when one becomes obsessed with material wealth and loses the meaning of true and transcendental values. Plato would see an example of how greed corrupts the human soul and moves it away from what really matters in life: justice, wisdom, and moral beauty. On the other hand, Aristotle, Plato's disciple, offers a more pragmatic interpretation and focused on practical ethics. In his work Ethics to Nicomachus, Aristotle advocates the virtue of moderation, a concept that refers to the ability to find the fair means between excesses. For Aristotle, the insatiable desire for Midas for more wealth and power is a clear example of how lack of moderation leads to disaster. In its philosophy, virtue is at the midpoint. The virtue of generosity, for example, is between prodigality, excess, and stingy, not giving anything. Aristotle also addresses the notion of happiness or eudaimonia, a central concept in its ethics. According to him, true happiness is not found in material pleasures or in the accumulation of wealth, but in the realization of our highest human abilities, such as reason, friendship, and justice. The myth of Midas, seen from this perspective, serves as a warning that the obsessive search for wealth is not only useless in achieving true happiness, but can become a trap that deprives the person of what really it gives you a full life. Aristotle also refers to the importance of ends, the results of our actions, and how they should be evaluated. Midas, in his desire to have everything turned into gold, pursues an end that is not only impossible to achieve satisfactorily, but also brings disastrous consequences. The history of Midas, in his opinion, illustrates how a selfish and badly conceived can lead to a disaster, underlining the need to have a clear sense of what really leads us to a well-lived life. Both philosophers agree that the myth of Midas is a powerful lesson on the consequences of excessive desire, although their approaches and solutions are somewhat different. Plato, with his emphasis on the search for good and justice, sees myth as a reflection of moral corruption that arises from the eagerness for material wealth. Aristotle, meanwhile, uses history to illustrate how lack of moderation can divert a person from the way to true happiness and balance in life. Ultimately, the myth of Midas remains a parable about the danger of being dragged by selfish desires and materialism, and Greek philosophers used it to urge reflection on the fundamental values that human life must guide. The history of the king who wanted everything in gold, only to discover that what looked like a wonderful gift was a curse, resonates with the idea that true value is not in what we possess, but in what we are and how we live our lives. The myth of Midas has been the subject of a deep ethical and moral reflection in Greek culture, becoming one of the most powerful stories about the dangers of greed and lack of moderation. In ancient Greece, myths not only served to entertain, but also to teach lessons: British English, human nature, and the virtues that should be cultivated to lead a fair and balanced life. In this sense, the myth of Midas offers a deep moral analysis that highlights the risks inherent to greed and the obsession with wealth, while illustrating the consequences of the lack of self-knowledge and reflection on their own decisions. From an ethical point of view, the myth of Midas shows the concept of hybris, the excess that is considered a serious moral lack in Greek mythology. Hybris refers to the attitude of challenging human limits and values established by the gods, believing that one can reach what you want without taking into account the consequences. The desire to convert everything that touched into gold is a clear example of hybris, since his greed leads him to ask for absolute power without thinking about his limitations or repercussions of such desire. The history of Midas, therefore, reflects the danger of human arrogance against the divine, and how obsession with power and wealth can blind us to the most fundamental needs of life. The fact that Midas did not stop considering the consequences of his desire also highlights a key issue in Greek ethics, the importance of prudence or phronsis. In the Greek philosophical tradition, prudence was one of the most valued virtues, since it was seen as the ability to make correct and wise decisions when weighing the pros and cons that one took. Midas, however, acts impulsively, without evaluating the possible ramifications of his desire, which leads him to a personal tragedy and the transformation of his life into a golden nightmare. The lack of prudence of Midas, which does not reflect on the true value of what it asks, shows that unbridled desire can lead to despair. The morality of history deepens even more when we observe the contrast between the material wealth that Midas obtains and the true riches of human life. At first, Midas believes that his power over gold is the solution to all his problems, but he soon realizes that he cannot feed, he cannot hug his loved ones, and beauty and nature escape his hands. History underlines the need to recognize what really gives meaning to life: love, family, human connection, and the enjoyment of simple pleasures. In this sense, myth teaches a valuable lesson about the relativity of material wealth and how the excessive search for it can strip us of what really matters. From a moral perspective, Midas is the prototype of man who sees life through the lens of selfishness and materialism. His story invites reflection on how, in the search for material abundance, people often lose sight of spiritual and emotional wealth. The tragedy that Midas suffers because of his foolish desire reflects how, often, erroneous values lead us on ways of destruction. Thus, the myth also raises the question of virtue in human life. Greek philosophers considered that virtue was in balance and moderation, principles that Midas fails to reach. The constant dissatisfaction of Midas, which never feels full despite its vast treasure, is a warning that true virtue is not in what you have, but in what you are. The repentance of Midas and its plea against Dionysus are also elements that add a moral nuance to history. At the moment Midas realizes the magnitude of his mistake, he seeks redemption. The arrival of the Pactolo River, which washes its curse and returns it to normal, can be interpreted as a symbol of purification and restoration. However, the redemption of Midas does not come in a simple or quick way, and through this process, the myth highlights the importance of genuine repentance as a necessary step towards self-knowledge and personal improvement. It is only when Midas faces the consequences of their actions and seeks the restoration that begins to learn the true moral lesson, the balance between desires and needs, and the recognition of the limits of what can be and should not be asked. In conclusion, the myth of Midas not only focuses on individual morality, but also offers a reflection on the fundamental values that human life must guide. Greed and lack of moderation are presented as vices that not only lead to personal suffering, but also alter natural order and human relationships. The touch of gold from Midas is a reminder that impulsive and selfish decisions can have devastating consequences, but also offers an opportunity for reflection, repentance, and the search for humility. The history of Midas, in ultima instance, teaches us that the true wealth of life does not lie in gold, but in the intangible aspects that make existence significant: love, wisdom, and virtue. Midas is, perhaps, one of the most emblematic characters in Greek mythology when it comes to representing temptation in its purest and destructive form. Its history, which revolves around such an intense desire for wealth that leads to ruin, not only transcends the borders of myth, but has endured over the centuries as a universal symbol of greed. Through their figure, the ancient Greeks, and later, the cultures that have inherited their legacy, have found a powerful lesson about the dangers inherent in greed. The myth of Midas begins with his encounter with Dionysus, the god of wine, fun, and pleasures. The king, seduced by the promise of a desire granted without understanding the true implications of his request, is the paradigm of temptation. When he asks for the power to convert everything he touches into gold, he does not imagine that this desire, apparently harmless, would immerse him in a nightmare. Its history is a clear reflection of how the human being, in his insatiable search to obtain more and more, can fall into a fatal trap, blinded by the illusion that material wealth will be the solution to all his problems. What makes me such a strong symbol of temptation is precisely its lack of reflection and the way it succumbs to an impulsive desire. Instead of being aware of the consequences of his desires, he gets carried away by the promise of absolute power and infinite wealth. This type of behavior, so human, has always been a reflection of how greed infiltrates people's daily decisions. Midas is not just a king, it is any individual who, in his excessive desire to obtain more, is willing to sacrifice everything that really matters in life. In Greek mythology, greed is not only a lack of generosity, but a vice that can corrupt the soul. Midas, as king, represents those who, in their eagerness to acquire more, lose sight of what really gives them value: love, family, nature. When asking everything that touched to become gold, Midas falls into the trap of thinking that gold is the only thing that can be satisfied. Gold, metal that symbolizes power and material wealth, becomes the only measure of value in its world. However, in the end, gold brings nothing more than despair. In a deeper sense, Midas is a reflection of how temptation can alter the perception of the individual. What begins as a blessing quickly becomes a curse. Wealth, which at first seems to be the solution to all its problems, becomes empty and hollow. His relationship with nature is destroyed, his daughter becomes a golden statue, and, in the end, Midas's desire does not provide happiness or satisfaction. The myth highlights how temptation can strip people of what is truly valuable in their lives. The figure of Midas is also a metaphor for the internal struggle between desire and reason, between immediate pleasure and longer-term consequences. Throughout history, Midas is represented as someone who succumbs to his wishes without considering the price. This lack of moderation and self-control is a reflection of how temptation can lead human beings to make impulsive decisions that result in an excessive dissatisfaction. Midas is not alone in your search for more. The history of his life resonates in each person who has ever succumbed to an immediate promise of immediate gratification, just to find that what they obtained is not what was expected. In this sense, Midas not only represents the king of Phrygia, but all those who seek temptation without thinking about repercussions. The temptation to love more, to have everything, to believe that material wealth can fill emotional and spiritual gaps, is a universal truth that does not distinguish between times or cultures. The lesson that leaves the myth of Midas is, therefore, timeless. Greed and greed not only destroy the individual, but also affect everything around him. The king is caught by his own desire and, in the end, he is a victim of the same temptation that he thought he would release him. The history of Midas also highlights the suffering that can arise when desire is excessive. While temptation in itself may seem tempting and full of promises, the myth teaches us that the rewards of greed are actually misleading. Throughout history, Midas experiences an internal transformation that goes beyond his desire for gold. He goes from being a powerful king and eager for wealth to a desperate man, alone, who has lost the most valuable. In his search for more, he has lost the very essence of life. Fine literally, as a symbol of temptation, it represents that part of all of us who fight against our own wishes. History invites us to reflect on how we handle our own greed and the way in which our impulsive decisions can alter not only our lives, but also the lives of those we love. In its history, Midas is a mirror of humanity, which constantly faces the temptation of desire without measuring the impact of its choices. The real lesson, in the end, is that excessive desires will never bring satisfaction, and the power of moderation and reflection is the only way to find true peace. In Greek myths, one of the most recurring lessons is the need for moderation and self-control in desires. Through their stories and characters, the Greeks show us how excess and lack of control can lead to tragedy. The virtue of temperance, which implies the balance between what is desired and what can be controlled, is presented as one of the keys to achieve peace and happiness. In a world where gods play with human destinations, moderation becomes an essential virtue to avoid divine punishment. One of the most representative myths that reflects the importance of self-control is that of Icaro. The young man, son of Daedalo, disobeyed his father's warnings and flew too close to the sun. His desire for freedom and power was stronger than the prudence that was advised. The sun melted the wax of its wings, and Icarus fell into the sea, paying with his life for not knowing how to moderate his impulse. This myth not only shows the danger of the lack of self-control, but also teaches that excessive ambition can make what is most valued. The fall of Icaro is the metaphor of how excess desires can drag someone to their own downfall. Another myth that exemplifies the need for moderation is that of Pandora, who, moved by curiosity, opened the prohibited box. In doing so, he released all the evils of the world, leaving only hope inside. Pandora represented the temptation and excessive curiosity, which in the end brought suffering and chaos to humanity. Although its action was impulsive and without evil, the result of not having exercised self-control was catastrophic. This myth reflects how small impulses, when they are not controlled, can have disproportionate consequences. The myth of Midas is also a powerful lesson about the importance of self-control. The king, blinded by his insatiable desire for wealth, asks for the gift of converting everything he touches into gold. His inability to see beyond greed leads him to lose what really mattered, the love of his daughter and the connection with humanity. This myth teaches that control over our desires is not only vital to avoid suffering, but also not to lose what gives value to life. In Greek mythology, the gods and heroes are often faced with evidence that challenges their self-control. Those who manage to moderate and make wise decisions are rewarded, while those who succumb to their impulses face fatal punishments and consequences. Through these stories, the Greeks teach us that true power does not reside in the ability to obtain everything that is desired, but in the ability to know what is really needed and at what time it is appropriate to act. Moderation also plays a key role in the teachings of the great Greek philosophers. Aristotle, for example, considered virtue as a midpoint between two ends, one of excess and another of deficiency. For him, moderation was the way to a balanced and virtuous life. According to Aristotle, self-control was essential to live according to reason and achieve true happiness. The history of Achilles in the Iliad also highlights the importance of self-control. Although the hero is recognized for his courage and strength, his lack of self-control in some key moments, such as his anger against Agamemnon, leads him to make impulsive decisions that affect the course of war. This loss of personal control reflects how excess pride and lack of moderation can change not only a person's fate, but also that of an entire nation. In myths, self-control is not only limited to material desires, such as wealth, but also to human emotions and passions. The Greeks understood that life was full of temptations, whether they were physical, emotional, or intellectual, and the only way to navigate them without falling into destruction was to learn to dominate impulses. The gods, who often represent extreme emotions, are also those who teach the hardest lessons about self-control. The history of Orpheus and Eurydice is another example of how the lack of self-control can have devastating effects. Orpheus, after losing his beloved and Eurydice, decides to descend to the underworld to rescue her. However, he cannot resist the temptation to look at her before leaving, breaking the condition imposed by Hades. His lack of self-control, his inability to trust the promise of the gods, costs him the life of Eurydice forever. This story is a warning about the need to trust the process and not succumb to impulsive desires, although suffering is great. In summary, Greek myths teach that self-control is not only a matter of physical or emotional moderation, but a virtue that must be cultivated to avoid self-destruction. The ability to dominate desires is essential to lead a full and balanced life. Greed, desire for power, anger, and excessive passion are powerful forces, but Greek myths show us that true power lies in the ability to control them. Thus, moderation becomes the key to a more harmonious existence, free of the devastating consequences that may arise when it is given to temptation. The figure of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, feast, lack of control and madness, appears in the myth of Midas as an ambiguous force that ranges between generosity and chaos. Dionysus, with its uncontrollable energy, its ability to alter the human mind and its influence on the senses, becomes the catalyst for the tragedy of Midas. It is he who, with his divine gift, sows in the heart of the king the seed of the most dangerous temptation, the desire for absolute power. A desire that, where appropriate, is embodied in gold. The myth begins with a fortuitous encounter, or perhaps predestined, between Dionysus and Midas. The god, on his way for Phrygia, meets Midas, who, on the other hand, shows his hospitality. Dionysus, a god known for his love of pleasure and celebration without restrictions, soon notes his capricious nature. It is then when Midas, in his naivety and desire to please God, offers his generosity. As a sample of gratitude, Dionysus decides to grant him a wish. Temptation, like a soft poison, begins to work in the king's soul. Midas, blinded by the golden brightness of greed, asks for a desire that will change your life forever, that everything you touch becomes gold. A seemingly simple desire, but loaded with fatal consequences. At this time, Dionysus does not stop Midas, nor does he warn him about what is to come. The divinity, which symbolizes freedom, excess, and indulgence, seems to have fun the king's request, as if they were making fun of the insignificance of mortals in the face of the wishes of the gods. This act of generosity on the part of Dionysus, which in appearance seems to be a gift, is actually a proof of the character of Midas and its relationship with power. Dionysus is not a god who gives favors without reason. His role in myth is marked by irony. Midas, when asking something as mundane as the power to transform everything into gold, reflects the deep emptiness of their desires. Gold is not a real good, but an illusion, a chimera that promises happiness but, in the end, only brings suffering. And Dionysus knows it. He is aware that gold cannot fill the king's empty soul. Dionysus's gift is not only a concession, but a painful lesson. Midas, like so many other characters in Greek mythology, is the victim of his own dissatisfied desires. Dionysus, by granting him the power to turn everything into gold, pushes him to the edge of the abyss. The temptation of absolute power, unlimited greed, becomes a deadly trap that God, in his mischievous wisdom, knows that Midas cannot handle. Through the figure of Dionysus, the myth of Midas tells us about the dangers of excess, how excessive wishes can cloud the vision of what really matters in life. Dionysus, a god linked to lack of control and celebration without limits, presents a true test for Midas, who does not know how to measure the consequences of his desire. Although God gives him what he asks, it is not a selfless act. There is a kind of challenge in its gesture, an invitation to explore the limits of power and humanity. In this sense, Dionysus not only acts as a generous benefactor, but also as a challenging figure, which puts Midas in front of the harsh reality of what it means to be a mortal wishing what is beyond its possibilities. While Midas feels owner of the world with his golden touch, Dionysus, in his laughing indifference, observes how the excess of human desires always ends up taking them to the disaster. The god, by granting absolute power over gold, also gives him the power to destroy everything he touches. And so, gold, instead of being a blessing, becomes a curse. The god of wine and madness does not seek the well-being of Midas, but rather puts it to the test, as a bitter lesson. Dionysus is not a god of tranquility or moderation. On the contrary, it is the one who represents chaos, the alteration of the norms, and the alteration of the senses. It is the god who, like wine, has the power to get drunk and destroy. Therefore, by granting me the touch of gold, it is revealing the consequences of excess. What seems to be a divine gift becomes a prison, a punishment disguised as unfulfilled desire. In this way, the myth of Midas, under Dionysus's gaze, becomes a warning about the danger of being carried away by wishes without thinking about the consequences. Dionysus, with his gift and his indifference, not only challenges Midas, but also challenges human understanding of what really matters. Gold, although it is a symbol of power and wealth, can never fill the existential void that drags the soul of man. In the relationship between Dionysus and Midas, the first acts as the provocateur who starts the fall of the second. While the king is seduced by the brightness of gold, Dionysus observes from the shadows, knowing that the power he has granted is not a real gift, but a bitter lesson that Midas will learn too late. And so, in his generosity, Dionysus demonstrates once again that the real challenge is not to obtain what we want, but in understanding the consequences of our desires. Midas, the king of Phrygia known for his insatiable desire for gold, becomes a central figure in classical Greek literature, although in a complex and multifaceted way. Its history is not only limited to the popular fable of Golden Touch, but is interpreted and adapted by various playwrights and poets, who explore the philosophical and moral implications of their excessive desire. In works by authors such as Euripides and Sophocles, Midas transcends their role of simple mythological figure to become a symbol of human contradictions, greed, and tragic lessons about desire. Euripides, known for their ability to humanize and complex mythological characters, presents Midas in his work Las Bacchantes in a subtly different way from the traditional version. Although Midas is not the protagonist of the work, his presence and the concept of his greed appear intertwined with the interactions between the god Dionysus and humans. In this context, Midas becomes a kind of captive figure of his own greed. The relationship between him and Dionysus, marked by the fearsome irony of the golden touch, resonates in the background of the work, because, like the king, other characters are also caught by excessive desires that dehumanize them. In Las Bacchantes, Midas appears as a character who, despite being a powerful king, is unable to escape the consequences of his wishes. The desire for control, the search for insatiable wealth, and the obsession with personal greatness is presented as a loop that unites Midas with the plot of the work. Here, the myth of Midas not only serves as a reminder of the danger of material desires, but also as a reflection on human impotence against divine power. In the work, Dionysus represents chaos and the dissolution of social norms, which is reflected in the condemnation of Midas to live a lonely existence, without the pleasures that wealth promised him. On the other hand, Sophocles, another of the great Greek playwrights, presents Midas in a more direct way in his work The Midas King. In this drama, Sophocles deepens the king's psychology, offering a more introspective vision of his relationship with wealth. Midas is not simply a king who asks for a silly desire, but a deeply disconnected monarch from the true values of human life. The tragedy is triggered when Midas, blinded by its greed, requests the gift of converting everything that touches into gold, without considering the consequences that this power will bring to your life and that of its people. In the Sophocles version, the myth of Midas is explored as a tragedy of self-destruction. The king, caught in his own greed, is unable to understand the true nature of what he has asked. Throughout the work, the power he wanted becomes a prison that isolates him both physically and emotionally. The most tragic scene occurs when Midas touches his own daughter, transforming her into a golden statue, which symbolizes the death of humanity and family values in favor of gold obsession. Sophocles not only presents the greed of Midas as a moral defect, but as an act that fads his humanity and takes him away from the essential love and connection with others. In both interpretations, Midas becomes a tragic symbol of greed and the consequences of not knowing how to balance human desires with the limits imposed by nature. Wealth and power, which in mythology are presented as achievements of Cerberus, in these Greek plays are transformed into symbols of destruction, existential vacuum, and loss of the most valuable. Midas, in his desire to get more, loses everything: his humanity, his family, and his happiness. In addition to the representation in Plaergo's works, Midas also becomes a recurring symbol in Greek philosophical reflection on desire and moderation. In the dialogues of Plato and Aristotle, the king is mentioned as an example of the fallacy of excess and how uncontrolled desire can lead to the ruin of human life. The history of Midas is used by philosophers to illustrate the importance of temperance and moderation as cardinal virtues that balance human passions. In summary, the myth of Midas becomes a rich source of reflection in classical Greek literature. From the tragedies of Euripides and Sophocles, to the philosophical teachings that explore the balance between desire and virtue, Midas represents the figure of excessive greed that, finally, is punished by divine forces. Its history is not only a warning story about the danger of greed, but also an exploration of human limits and how absolute power, when it is achieved without reflection, can destroy everything it touches. The figure of Midas, with his excessive greed and his tragic transformation into a slave being of his desire, not only left an indelible mark on Greek mythology, but also in classical art. Although it is not as prominent as other mythological heroes, Midas was represented in various art forms during ancient Greece, particularly in ceramics, sculpture, and theatre. In each of these representations, Midas symbolized the ambiguous relationship between humanity, divinity, and dangers inherent in excess. Classical Greek art is characterized by its ability to capture both beauty and human tragedies, and the history of Midas fits perfectly into this mold. Often, the artistic works that represent it highlight both their material wealth and the inner suffering caused by your curse. One of the most common representations of Midas in ceramics is one in which it is shown with a royal figure, surrounded by wealth, but with an expression of despair or anguish, aware that the gold that surrounds it is, ultimately, a conviction. In Greek ceramics, in particular in the glasses of red and black figures, Midas is represented in various ways, but always under a light that highlights contrasts between its external greatness and its growing internal despair. In some scenes, you can see him at the time he meets Dionysus and asks for the golden touch, while in others, his face reflects the horror of having touched his daughter and seeing her become a gold statue. These images impressively illustrate the void behind the wealth and suffering that can accompany excessive power. For example, a glass of red figures found in one of the tombs of ancient Greece shows Midas in the act of asking Dionysus for the desire to convert everything he touched into gold. Dionysus, represented in a quiet and powerful posture, seems to be the spokesman for the inevitable consequences. This image not only illustrates the scene, but also reflects the duality of divine and human power. While Midas represents unbridled desire, Dionysus is the force that puts the limits to those desires, showing that what seems like a gift can become a curse. The sculpture also captures the tragedy of Midas, although in a more monumental style. In sculptural art, it is not so common to find direct representations of Midas due to its most secondary role in mythology, but there are examples in which it is mentioned or pays tribute indirectly. In some statues dedicated to Dionysus, there is the representation of Midas as a character linked to the god of wine and madness. It is possible that the history of Midas has been considered as a warning about the dangers of the excesses of Dionysus, whose cult was closely related to indulgence and freedom without restrictions. The most famous Midas scene in classical art is probably that of your encounter with satyrs. The satyrs, half-man beings, half-animal, associated with drunkenness and music, often appear in the stories surrounding the king. In these representations, Midas, often exhibiting its real dress, is portrayed with a mixture of fascination and horror while encountering these uninhibited beings, who drag it to the chaos of indulgence. These elements reflect not only the myth of Midas, but also the philosophical ideas of classical Greece on control and chaos. Midas, like King, is destined to be a leader, but is unable to control the forced sleeping nature and human instincts that satyros represent. The representation of Midas in classical art reflects a more philosophical approach to mythology. Through its history, issues of desire, greed, repentance, and human limitation against the gods are raised. In painting and sculpture, the gold in which Midas becomes, far from being the object of desire that in principle seems to be, it becomes a visual metaphor for alienation and loneliness. Often, artists insist on showing how the accumulation of wealth does not bring happiness, but leaves Midas trapped in a cycle of despair and repentance. The connection with the god Dionysus also has a fundamental role in these representations. As a god who, in mythology, is related to the liberation of social norms and pleasure without control, Dionysus appears in many of Midas's artistic representations as a contradiction figure. While Midas seeks power and unlimited richness, Dionysus, by granting desire, gives him a painful lesson about the dangers of lack of control and lack of moderation. In summary, Midas' representations in classical Greek art not only capture the tragedy of their excessive desire, but also the moral and philosophical lessons that Midas's story tries to convey. Through ceramics, sculpture, and other art forms, the Greeks explored the contradiction between power and despair, and how insatiable desire can lead to ruin. Midas, as a symbol of greed, remains a relevant figure in the artistic tradition, representing the tension between human desire and the consequences that derive from it. The figure of Midas, with its excessive wealth and the tragedy that accompanies its uncontrolled desire, is not only reflected in the visual arts and the Greek theatre, but also in poetry. In ancient Greece, poetry was used to explore the deepest issues of the human condition, and the myth of Midas lent itself to various poetic interpretations, both in lyric and epic. In poetic works, Midas becomes a symbol of the struggle between ambition, greed, and the lessons that the gods seek to teach mortals. In epic poetry, which focuses on heroic stories and great feats, the myth of Midas is rarely the center of attention, but its presence is remarkable in allusions and references. Poets such as Hesiod and Pindaro make use of Midas to illustrate the consequences of excess and human arrogance in front of the gods. Hesiod, in their Theogony, and other tragic poets mention Midas as an example of how excessive ambition can lead to ruin. Although Midas is not the main protagonist of these works, its history becomes a warning within a broader context about the relationship of mortals with the divine. In particular, Hesiod's Theogony, although he does not directly tell Midas, mentions his touch of gold as an example of the intervention of the gods and the insignificance of human desires before their power. Hesiod's work reflects the vision of the Greek world in which mortals are perceived as fragile and limited, and their excessive desires are, ultimately, punished by the divine forces. In this context, Midas represents human vulnerability to the relentless justice of the gods. In lyric poetry, Midas appears more directly in several compositions. Lyric poets, unlike epic, focused more on emotions, personal desires, and reflections on life and morals. Poets such as Pindaro and Bacchylides include in their works references to King Midas, using his figure as a reflection on greed and the relationship with the gods. In the Ode to Dionysus de Pindaro, the poet refers to Midas as a reminder of the foolishness of wishing power without thinking about the consequences. The reference in these poems is almost always a warning that greed and lack of moderation leads to suffering and misfortune. For example, in some of the lyrical poems of ancient Greece, Midas is used as a symbol of the fall of man in the insatiable search for wealth and power. The tone in these poems is reflective, questioning the very nature of human desire and its relationship with fortune. The touch of gold of Midas is represented not only as a gift, but as a disguised curse. Lyric poets transmit how the ephemeral beauty of wealth can lead to despair, something that becomes a recurring theme throughout the poetry of this era. In some of the poems of ancient Greece, Midas is also portrayed in his encounter with satyrs, mythological beings known for their connection with wine and excess. In these stories, Midas appears as a king whom music and drunkenness affect him deeply, which leads him to an identity crisis and a divine judgment that will change his life forever. This relationship with satyrs highlights the idea that temptation and hedonism can divert men on their way, leading them to fall into an abyss of greed and selfishness. In the most philosophical poems of ancient Greece, Midas is also used as an example of humans' fragility in front of the gods. The idea that the gods play with the destinies of mortals and that, despite all human power, man remains vulnerable to his desires and errors, is a central theme in lyric poetry. Tragic poets, such as Euripides, also evoke Midas in their reflections on the nature of wealth and power. In his works, the figure of Midas becomes a reminder that greed without control can lead to an inevitable fall, and that the destiny of man is at the mercy of the gods. In summary, Midas is an omnipresent figure in Greek poetry, from epic to lyric, where its history is used to explore human nature, the relationship with the divine, and the consequences of greed. In the compositions of poets such as Hesiod, Pindaro, and Euripides, Midas is presented as a tragic figure whose greed and excessive desire lead him to despair. References to the king and his touch of gold serve as a warning for mortals, a lesson about the dangers of desire without measure, and the need for moderation. In poetry, Midas is not only a mythological character, but a symbol of human vices that, through their suffering, invites us to reflect on morality and lessons that the gods seek to teach us. The myth of Midas has remained a source of inspiration for modern and contemporary writers, who have rescued, reinterpreted and adapted to explore universal issues such as greed, repentance, and human nature. In modern literature, Midas is more than just the king with the touch of gold, it becomes a symbol of tensions between personal desire and the inevitable consequences of human acts. One of the most interesting aspects of the modern use of Midas's figure is how contemporary authors explore their history from new perspectives, questioning the original myth or transferring it to completely different contexts. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, Midas has appeared in numerous literary works, either as a central figure or as an indirect reference that resonates with the complexity of human emotions. In poetry and contemporary narrative, Midas is often reinterpreted as a symbol of obsession with wealth and material success. Instead of being just a king of antiquity, Midas represents the desire of modern man to achieve happiness through the accumulation of material goods. Contemporary writers focus on criticism of this vision of the world, where the touch of gold is no longer only a divine punishment, but a reflection of the consequences of obsession with money and power in contemporary society. One of the most common approaches in modern literature is to humanize Midas. In the traditional versions of the myth, Midas is an almost one-dimensional character and greedy king who pays a terrible price for his insatiable desire for wealth. However, in contemporary literature, Midas is often presented as a more complex man, caught between his own desires and the expectations of the surrounding society. Writers explore their internal conflict, repentance, and the struggle to find redemption, adding emotional depth to a myth that could originally have been considered as a simple moral lesson. A clear example of the modern reinterpretation of the Midas myth is found in the work of authors such as the British novelist E.M. Foster. In his novel Howard's End, Henry Wilcox's character can be seen as a reflection of Midas, while he is a man obsessed with money, property, and success. Through its history, Foster reflects on the moral implications of the accumulation of wealth and the emotional emptiness that this can generate. Although the touch of gold is not literal in this case, the myth becomes a metaphor for emotional isolation and the loss of the essential in life, issues that remain relevant in modern literature. The Midas version has also been adapted in the field of fantastic and science fiction literature. In many of these stories, the golden touch is replaced by some form of extraordinary power, such as the ability to transform the world at will. In these contexts, the myth of Midas is updated to represent the danger inherent in absolute control, a concern central in contemporary literature. Science fiction and fantasy writers explore how the irresponsible use of power can lead to disastrous consequences, making the myth of Midas even more relevant in a modern world dominated by technology and the desire for control over nature. Midas's symbolism has also been widely examined in contemporary feminist literature. Authors such as Sylvia Plath and Margaret Atwood have resorted to the myth of Midas to reflect on power dynamics and control. In Atwood's work, for example, the theme of touch of gold can be interpreted as a criticism of women's objectification and the desire to possess and control everything that is desired. The myth of Midas, in this case, becomes a metaphor of how people, especially women, can be transformed into objects of desire and property into a world where power relations are unequal. In modern poetry, writers like Ted Hughes have also taken the myth of Midas as a starting point to explore the relationship between man and nature. In his collection of poems such from Ovid, Hughes reinterprets many Greek myths, including Midas, underlining the connection between human greed and the destruction of the natural world. Midas, in this case, becomes a symbol of how human desires, when they are not moderate, can irreversibly alter the balance of the world. Throughout the 21st century, the myth of Midas remains relevant in popular literature and contemporary culture, especially through adaptations in novels, cinema, and theater. In many of these stories, the touch of gold is portrayed symbolically, as a comment on the dangers of superficiality and materialism. In some cases, Midas appears as a secondary character or as a figure that serves as a warning for the main characters, showing how even the most powerful beings can fall victims of their own excessive desires. For example, in youth literature, Midas has been interpreted as a character whose bad decisions serve young people about the dangers of greed and selfishness. The elements of the myth are maintained, but the approach tends to be more accessible, offering life lessons to younger readers about the importance of values such as generosity and empathy. In many modern versions of myth, the desire for wealth faces the importance of human relations and genuine feelings, offering a more human and realistic interpretation of what the touch of gold represents. In conclusion, Midas remains a relevant character in modern literature, adapted and reinterpreted in forms that explore the complexities of human nature and excessive desire. Whether in social criticism, the symbolism of greed, or the analysis of human psychology, the myth of Midas continues to offer a rich source of reflection for contemporary writers. The history of Midas is not only an ancient lesson about greed, but a timeless story that continues to resonate in the modern world, where desires and their consequences remain as relevant as they were in ancient Greece. The history of Midas has endured over the centuries, transforming from an ancient Greek myth into a universal symbol that transcends cultures, times, and disciplines. His legacy not only remains in mythological stories, but has penetrated deeply into the collective psyche, becoming a constant reference in literature, art, philosophy, and popular culture. The touch of gold of Midas, which originally focused on a lesson of humility and moderation, remains a timeless warning about the dangers of excessive desire and human greed. The influence of Midas is so strong that its history has been absorbed by various cultural and social movements. In contemporary society, the figure of King Midas has become an archetypal representation of the destructive effects of materialism and greed. Its history is no longer limited to being a lesson about wealth and power, but has adapted to comment on obsession with consumption, fame, and accumulation of goods, so prevalent in the modern world. This myth has found its place in popular culture, especially in cinema, television, and music. Films and series of various genres use the figure of Midas as a metaphor for personal transformation, but also as a warning about the limits of desire. In the most modern narratives, Midas is not only a greedy king, but a complex character whose actions show us how the relentless search for material perfection can end up destroying everything, including human relationships and emotional well-being. In the AM literary Beto, the history of Midas has been reinterpreted by innumerable authors, who have placed their emphasis on different aspects of myth. While some have focused on the tragedy of their desire, others have explored the redemption or repentance of Midas, emphasizing how the transformation suffered by the king forces him to face his own nature and his mistakes. Writers not only seek to perpetuate the legend, but also to reflect on the human and universal aspects that it contains: sacrifice, despair, decision-making, and consequences. At the philosophical level, Midas has served as a paradigmatic example to explore issues of ethics and morality. Philosophers of all times have used the myth to discuss the nature of human desire, the importance of moderation and balance in life, and the relationship between wealth and happiness. In the Greek context, thinkers as Aristotle saw in Midas a representation of excess, a reminder that good living is not in the accumulation of material goods, but in the search for virtue and self-knowledge. In modern psychology, the myth of Midas has become a reflection of the internal struggle of the human being between superficial desires and the desire for emotional and spiritual fulfillment. The myth of the golden touch resonates strongly with the psychology of the individual who, in his search for success and power, runs the risk of losing what matters most in his life: love, family, and genuine connection with others. The history of Midas, thus, becomes a warning about the temptation of instant gratification and the consequences of prioritizing materialism on emotional and spiritual needs. Midas's legacy is also present in the economy, where its history is used as a metaphor for the growing obsession with money and wealth in capitalist societies. The figure of King Midas has become a symbol of power and excessive greed of the great corporations and influential individuals in the financial world. In a broader sense, myth is used to illustrate how the accumulation of wealth without a genuine purpose can generate emptiness and chaos in the lives of those who seek only personal enrichment. The golden touch of Midas has also been used as a metaphor of art and creation. Throughout art history, Midas has been represented in paintings, sculptures, and other forms of visual expression, often highlighting its ambition and tragedy inherent in its insatiable desire. Artists have used myth to explore the issue of human power and fragility, suggesting that even the most beautiful or valuable creations can be ephemeral and destructive when they become the sole objective of existence. In the spiritual context, the myth of Midas invites reflection on the importance of detachment. In many religious and philosophical traditions, it is taught that the true meaning of life is not found in material goods, but in the connection with the divine, internal wisdom and compassion for others. The history of Midas illustrates how the eagerness for possessing and controlling everything can lead to the loss of the most valuable, the sense of unity with the universe and inner welfare. The myth of Midas has not lost its power over time because it treats deeply human issues: greed, repentance, transformation, and desire. The history of the king who wanted more than he could handle remains relevant because he reflects the constant struggle between the wishes of the individual and the lessons that life teaches us. Midas, with its touch of gold, has become a symbol of the struggle to find balance, of the warning that wishes without moderation can lead to destruction, but also from the possibility of redemption if you learn from errors. Midas's legacy is still alive in culture because its history, more than a simple Greek myth, is a universal fable. The king who wanted gold, without thinking about its consequences, continues to be a timeless warning about the limits of human desires and the importance of looking for what really matters in life. Today, the history of Midas continues to resonate, reminding us that the true value of our lives is not measured in gold, but in human connections, love, humility, and wisdom we acquire along the way.